I had been driving for hours, the monotonous hum of the engine and the endless stretch of highway threatening to lull me to sleep. It was well past midnight when I spotted the neon sign on the side of the road. The Lone Star Motel. Vacancy. Relief washed over me as I pulled into the gravel lot, the crunching sound beneath my tires signaling the end of my long journey. The motel was a single-story building with a row of doors facing the parking lot, each illuminated by a flickering overhead light. It wasn't much to look at, but it was exactly what I needed, a place to rest for the night. I parked my car and stepped out, stretching my tired limbs. The night air was cool and a gentle breeze rustled through the trees that surrounded the motel. I made my way to the office, the crunch of gravel underfoot echoing in the stillness of the night. The office was small and dimly lit, the counter separating me from a middle-aged man with tired eyes and a worn-out expression. He glanced up from his newspaper as I entered, offering me a half-hearted smile. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice lacking any enthusiasm. "I need a room for the night," I replied, equally unenthusiastic after hours of driving. He nodded as if expecting nothing more. "How many nights?" "Just one," I said, relieved to be spending only a single night at this dreary place. He pushed a weathered guest book toward me and I scribbled my name and contact information. He handed me a key with a plastic fob that read room 7 inches and pointed to a small map of the motel. "Your room is at the end of the building on the left," he said, his tone never wavering. I handed him some cash and he counted it meticulously before handing me a receipt. "That'll be $50, he said, as if the amount was etched in stone. I took the key and thanked him, then made my way to room 7. The motel was eerily quiet, the only sound the soft hooting of an owl in the distance. The door to my room was worn and faded, the paint peeling in places. I inserted the key and turned the handle, the door creaking open to reveal a dimly lit interior. The room was simple, with a double bed covered in faded floral sheets, a nightstand, and a rickety old chair in the corner. The overhead light flickered ominously, casting unsettling shadows on the walls. I switched on the bedside lamp, illuminating the room in a soft yellow glow. As I settled into bed, I couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. The room had an odd, almost oppressive atmosphere, as if it held secrets of its own. The air was heavy, as though it hadn't been refreshed in years. I tried to shake off the feeling and closed my eyes, but sleep was slow to come. Every creak of the floorboards, every distant sound from the office seemed magnified in the stillness of the night. It was as if the motel itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Hours passed and I was still awake, my mind racing with thoughts of the long road ahead. That's when I heard it, a soft whispering voice. It was faint at first, like a distant murmur carried on the wind. I strained to listen, trying to make out the words. The voice grew louder, more distinct, and I realized it was coming from the room next door. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was urgent, panicked. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding, and pressed my ear to the wall. "Please, no," a woman's voice pleaded, followed by the sound of muffled sobs. My blood ran cold and I reached for my phone, ready to call 911. But just as I was about to dial, the voice stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the faint hum of the motel's aging air conditioning unit. I hesitated, torn between my instincts to help and a growing sense of dread. What if it had all been in my head? What if I was overreacting? I lay back down, trying to convince myself that it was just a nightmare, a trick of my tired mind. But sleep remained elusive and the minutes ticked by slowly. Finally, as the first light of dawn began to filter through the curtains, I couldn't stand it any longer. I had to know if the woman next door was all right. I got out of bed and approached the connecting door between our rooms. I listened carefully, but there was no sound, no movement from the other side. Gathering my courage, I knocked softly. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. There was no response, just an eerie silence that seemed to stretch on forever. I knocked again, louder this time, and called out once more, but still there was nothing. With my heart in my throat, I turned the doorknob slowly, my palms sweaty. The door swung open to reveal an empty, dimly lit room. The bed was neatly made, and there was no sign of the woman I had heard. It was as if she had never been there. I stepped into the room, my heart still racing, and checked the bathroom, the closet, and even under the bed. But there was no one. It was impossible, I thought. I had heard her cries, her pleas for help, as clear as day. I returned to my own room, my mind a whirlwind of confusion and fear. Had it all been a hallucination? A trick played by my sleep-deprived mind? I couldn't make sense of it, but one thing was clear. I needed to get out of that motel as soon as possible. I hastily packed my things and went to the office to check out. The same clerk was there, his expression unchanged. I tried to explain what I had heard, but he only shrugged. "People come and go all the time," he said, as if dismissing my concerns. Maybe she checked out early. I left the motel in a hurry, my heart heavy with unease. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong with that place, something hidden beneath its nondescript exterior. I continued my journey, putting miles between myself and the Lone Star Motel. The day passed in a blur, and as night fell once again, I found myself in another town, another motel. This one was newer, cleaner, and more welcoming. I checked in without hesitation, determined to put the strange events of the previous night behind me. But as I settled into bed, I couldn't escape the feeling that I was being watched. The room was pristine, the air fresh, yet I couldn't shake the eerie sensation that I was not alone. I glanced out the window, half expecting to see a face in the darkness, but there was nothing. I tried to dismiss my unease and closed my eyes, willing myself to sleep. But just as I was on the brink of slumber, I heard it again. The soft, whispering voice. The same urgent, panic tone. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding in my chest. It was coming from the room next door, just like before. This time, I wasted no time. I grabbed my phone and called 911, my voice trembling as I explained the situation. The police arrived quickly, and I led them to the room next door. The door was locked, and they had to force it open. Inside, they found a woman, disheveled and terrified. She had been held against her will, the victim of a deranged man who had been stalking her for months. As they arrested the man and led him away in handcuffs, the woman thanked me, tears in her eyes. She had been sure that no one would hear her cries, that no one would come to her aid. She had almost given up hope. I couldn't help but think back to the Lone Star Motel, to the woman I had heard but had never seen. Had she been a victim too? Had I missed my chance to help her? I never found out the answer, but one thing was certain. The events of that night had changed me forever. I couldn't erase the memory of those whispered pleas for help, the feeling of unease that had followed me from that motel. As I continued my journey, I couldn't help but wonder about the darkness that could hide behind the most ordinary facades, the secrets that could be buried beneath the surface. The world was a vast and unpredictable place, and I had learned that even in the most unlikely of places, heroes could emerge, and villains could be unmasked. I drove on, my headlights cutting through the darkness, my mind forever haunted by the night I had spent at the Lone Star Motel, a place where the line between reality and the unknown had blurred, and where the true nature of fear had been revealed. Story 2. It was a bleak and stormy night when I found myself driving down a desolate stretch of highway, the windshield wipers struggling to keep pace with the relentless rain. The gloomy landscape outside offered no solace, and I knew I had to find shelter soon. That's when I saw the neon sign flickering weakly in the downpour, like a lighthouse beckoning a lost sailor. The Midnight Haven Motel, it read. The sign was old and worn, but it promised warmth and a respite from the raging storm. With a sense of relief, I pulled into the gravel lot and parked my car under the dimly lit canopy. As I stepped out of my vehicle, I was immediately greeted by the harsh wind and rain, which seemed to intensify in this desolate part of the country. I hurried to the office, my soaked clothes clinging to my body, my shoes squishing with every step. The motel office was a small, dimly lit room that smelled of stale cigarette smoke and old wood. Behind the counter sat a middle-aged man with a gruff demeanor. He barely looked up from his newspaper when I entered, acknowledging me with a simple nod. "Need a room?" he grumbled as if I were inconveniencing him. "Yes, please," I replied, my voice quivering from the cold. "How many nights?" he asked, his eyes fixed on the sports section of his newspaper. "Just one," I answered, eager to be on my way in the morning. He handed me a tarnished key with a plastic fob that read Room 9. "That'll be $50, he said without a hint of a smile. I handed him the cash and he counted it meticulously, as if suspecting me of trying to cheat him out of a few dollars. Finally, he handed me a receipt and I took the key and headed out into the storm once more. Room 9 was at the end of a long, dimly lit corridor. The hallway was narrow and lined with peeling wallpaper, the carpet underfoot damp and musty. The place had clearly seen better days. I fumbled with the key in the lock, and when I finally entered the room, I was greeted by a stark and dimly lit space. The room was small, containing only the essentials: a lumpy double bed with faded sheets, a rickety nightstand with a flickering lamp, and a small dusty television mounted on the wall. The air was thick with the scent of mildew, and the walls seemed to close in around me. I quickly stripped off my wet clothes and turned on the lukewarm shower. The bathroom was equally unimpressive, with cracked tiles and a showerhead that sputtered water intermittently. As I stood under the tepid stream, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It was an irrational fear, I told myself, a product of my exhaustion and the eerie atmosphere of the motel. After the shower, I dried off and dressed in the spare clean clothes I had packed. I climbed into bed, hoping to find solace in sleep, but the uneasy feeling lingered. The rain outside showed no signs of letting up, and the incessant tapping on the window pane only added to my discomfort. I tried to shake off my unease and closed my eyes, but sleep remained elusive. Every creak of the floorboards in the corridor, every distant sound from the office, seemed magnified in the stillness of the night. The storm outside raged on, the wind howling like a restless spirit. Just as I was beginning to drift off, I heard it, a soft, eerie whispering. It was barely audible at first, like a faint rustling of leaves in the wind. I strained to listen, trying to make out the words, but they were just beyond my grasp. The whispering grew louder, more distinct, and I realized it was coming from the room next door. It was a woman's voice, and she sounded panicked, her words tumbling out in a desperate stream. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding as I tried to make sense of what I was hearing. "Please, you have to let me go," she pleaded, her voice trembling with fear. I strained to hear more, but the words became unintelligible, as if she were speaking in a language I couldn't understand. It was as though she were caught in the grip of some terrible nightmare. Fear gripped me, and I considered calling the police, but I had no way of knowing if the woman next door was in real danger or if she was suffering from some kind of delusion. I sat in my room, paralyzed by uncertainty as the woman's pleas grew louder and more frantic. The minutes stretched on, and I couldn't take it any longer. I had to do something. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, explaining the situation to the operator. She assured me that help was on the way and urged me to stay in my room. I waited anxiously, the minutes feeling like hours, until I heard the sound of sirens approaching. The police arrived quickly, and I led them to the room next door, my heart pounding with dread. The officers knocked on the door, identifying themselves, but there was no response from inside. With a sense of urgency, they forced the door open, and I watched as they entered the room, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. I could see nothing from my vantage point in the hallway, but I strained to listen, hoping to hear some sign that the woman was safe. Then there was a scream, a bone-chilling, blood-curdling scream that sent shivers down my spine. It was followed by the sound of a struggle, of furniture being overturned, of desperate cries for help. I wanted to rush into the room to assist the officers, but fear kept me rooted to the spot. The struggle seemed to go on forever, the woman's screams echoing through the corridor until finally there was silence, a silence that was even more unsettling than the chaos that had preceded it. The officers emerged from the room, their faces pale and grim. They told me that the woman had been alone in the room, her frantic screams and pleas for help seemingly directed at an invisible assailant. There was no sign of forced entry, no evidence of an intruder. I was left in a state of shock and confusion. Had I imagined the woman's cries for help, or had she been the victim of some unseen supernatural force? The officers assured me that she was now in their care and would receive the help she needed. But the mystery of what had transpired in that room haunted me. I couldn't stay at the Midnight Haven Motel any longer. The sense of unease and dread that hung in the air was suffocating, and I longed to put the unsettling events of the night behind me. I checked out of the motel early the next morning, and as I drove away, I couldn't help but glance back at the flickering neon sign. The storm had passed and the motel looked almost peaceful in the pale light of dawn. But I knew that appearances could be deceiving, that darkness could lurk beneath even the most ordinary of facades. As I continued my journey, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had witnessed something beyond explanation, something that defied reason and logic. The memory of that night would stay with me, a chilling reminder that the line between reality and the unknown is thinner than we dare to imagine, and that the scariest things can often be found in the most unexpected places. Story 3. The rain pounded against the windshield as I pulled into the parking lot of the dilapidated motel. The neon sign above the office flickered intermittently, casting an eerie glow on the cracked asphalt. It was late, and I was tired from hours of driving through the desolate countryside. I just needed a place to rest for the night, and this was the only option for miles. As I approached the motel office, I couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. The building looked as though it had seen better days, its paint peeling and its windows covered in a thick layer of grime. A flickering vacancy sign hung in the window, its letters missing here and there, making it hard to read at first glare. I stepped inside, a bell above the door jingling softly. The interior was dimly lit, and the air was heavy with the musty scent of old carpet and cigarette smoke. A bored-looking clerk sat behind the counter, her eyes glued to a small television that played a rerun of some late-night talk show. "Can I help you?" she mumbled without looking up. "I need a room for the night," I replied, trying to sound more confident than I felt. She finally looked up, her eyes cold and distant. "We got rooms," she said, her voice devoid of enthusiasm. "How many nights?" "Just one," I said quickly, eager to be out of there. She handed me a tarnished key attached to a plastic fob with a faded room number, 13. "That'll be $50, she said, her tone as dull as ever. I handed her the cash and she counted it slowly, her long, nicotine-stained fingers moving methodically. Finally satisfied, she handed me a worn-out receipt and a rusty key. "Room 13 is at the end of the building," she said, her gaze returning to the television. I grabbed the key and made my way down a dimly lit corridor, the carpet underfoot squishing with each step. The corridor seemed to stretch on forever, and I couldn't help but feel a growing sense of unease. The motel was eerily quiet, save for the distant hum of the rain outside and the low drone of the television from the office. When I reached room 13, I hesitated for a moment before inserting the key into the lock. The door creaked open, revealing a small, dimly lit room. The air inside was stifling, and I quickly opened a window to let in some fresh air. The room was sparsely furnished with a sagging double bed, a rickety nightstand, and a flickering overhead light that cast eerie shadows on the walls. As I settled in for the night, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I tried to dismiss it as my imagination playing tricks on me, but the sensation persisted. I glanced out the window and saw nothing but darkness and rain. It was just my tired mind, I told myself, playing tricks on me after a long day on the road. I decided to take a shower to relax and wash away the grime of the day. The bathroom was equally dismal, with cracked tiles and a showerhead that sputtered water sporadically. As I stepped under the lukewarm water, I couldn't help but feel a creeping sense of unease. It was as though the shadows in the corners of the bathroom were moving, shifting ever so slightly. I quickly finished my shower and stepped out, wrapping a towel around myself. I tried to push the eerie feeling from my mind as I got dressed and climbed into bed. The rain outside had intensified, the drumming on the roof like a steady heartbeat. I pulled the scratchy motel blanket up to my chin and tried to relax, but sleep eluded me. Every creak of the floorboards in the corridor, every distant sound from the office, seemed amplified in the silence of the night. I tossed and turned, my mind racing with thoughts of the strange motel and its even stranger inhabitants. Suddenly I heard a soft, rhythmic tapping on the window. My heart raced as I sat up in bed, my eyes fixed on the glass. The tapping continued, growing louder and more insistent with each passing moment. I hesitated for a moment, my hand trembling as I reached for the curtain. When I finally pulled the curtain aside, I gasped in horror. A figure stood outside, obscured by the rain-smeared glass. It was a man, his face hidden beneath a hooded raincoat, but I could see the glint of something metallic in his hand. A knife. I stumbled back in terror, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure continued to tap on the window, his eyes locked on mine. I fumbled for my phone, my hands shaking as I dialed 911, but as I brought the phone to my ear, I realized there was no dial tone, only static. The figure outside the window began to speak, his voice muffled by the glass but filled with an unsettling calmness. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, his words sending a chill down my spine. "This place, it's not what it seems." I backed away from the window, my mind racing with fear and confusion. Who was this man, and what did he mean? I glanced around the room, searching for anything that could help me defend myself. The room was bare, with no weapons in sight. As I turned back to the window, the figure had disappeared. I hesitated for a moment, my breath coming in ragged gasps, before I mustered the courage to approach the window once more. I cautiously peered outside, but the man was gone, leaving no trace of his presence. I locked the window and pulled the curtains closed, my heart still pounding in my chest. I knew I had to get out of there, but the rain outside showed no signs of letting up. I had no choice but to wait until morning. I spent the rest of the night in a state of heightened anxiety, my senses on high alert. Every sound, every creak of the floorboards seemed like a potential threat. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something sinister lurked in the shadows of the motel. When morning finally came, I wasted no time packing my things and checking out of the motel. The clerk at the front desk seemed as disinterested as ever, and I couldn't bring myself to tell her about the terrifying encounter I had endured. As I drove away from the motel, I couldn't help but wonder about the strange events of the night. Who was the mysterious figure outside my window, and what did he mean by, "This place is not what it seems"? I knew I would never have answers to those questions, but I also knew that I never wanted to set foot in that motel again. The rain had finally stopped, and the sun had broken through the clouds, casting a warm glow on the countryside. I took a deep breath, relieved to be leaving that nightmarish place behind. But as I glanced in my rearview mirror, I could have sworn I saw a faint figure standing in the doorway of room 13, watching me leave with hollow, empty eyes. I sped away, putting as much distance between myself and that motel as possible. The memory of that night would haunt me for the rest of my days, a chilling reminder that sometimes the scariest things are not the ones that go bump in the night, but the ones that lurk in the darkest corners of our own minds. Living with roommates was nothing new to me. In fact, it had been a significant part of my adult life since graduating from college. The shared rent, responsibilities, and the occasional company of fellow housemates had always seemed like a reasonable arrangement. But when my new roommate, John, introduced me to his girlfriend, Sarah, our home dynamic took a turn into uncharted territory, revealing a dark secret that would forever change my perspective on shared living. John had moved in about a month ago, taking over the room across the hall from mine in our cozy two-bedroom apartment. He was a friendly, easygoing guy, always ready with a joke or a helping hand when needed. He had mentioned his girlfriend, Sarah, a few times in passing, but I hadn't had the chance to meet her until one fateful Friday evening. I was relaxing in the living room, engrossed in a book, when I heard the front door swing open, followed by the muffled sound of conversation. I looked up as John and a woman entered the apartment. She was petite, with a cascade of jet black hair and an air of mystery that seemed to envelop her. "Hey, this is Sarah," John said with a warm smile. "Sarah, meet my roommate, Alex." Sarah extended her hand and I shook it, offering a polite greeting. There was something about her that piqued my curiosity, a sense that there was more to her than met the eye. But I dismissed it as mere intrigue, thinking that perhaps it was just my overactive imagination. As the weeks went by, Sarah became a regular presence in our apartment. She and John spent most evenings together, cooking dinner, watching movies, and sharing stories of their day. On the surface, they appeared to be the picture-perfect couple, deeply in love and genuinely happy. However, I couldn't help but notice that Sarah had a certain aloofness about her. She would often retreat into herself, lost in thought as if carrying a weighty secret. I tried to respect their privacy and dismissed it as a personal quirk, but a growing unease began to gnaw at me. One evening, I found myself alone in the kitchen with Sarah. John had gone out to run some errands, leaving us in an awkward silence. I decided to break the ice. "So Sarah, how did you and John meet?" I asked, trying to keep the conversation light. Her eyes flickered with a shadow of something I couldn't quite place. a mixture of sadness and fear. "We met at a support group," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "A support group?" I asked, intrigued and concerned by her answer. Sarah hesitated for a moment before continuing. "Yes, it's a group for people who have experienced trauma," she said, choosing her words carefully. I could sense that Sarah was holding something back, something dark and painful. I didn't want to pry, but my curiosity got the better of me. "Trauma?" I asked gently, hoping she would open up a little more. She took a deep breath, her eyes welling with tears. "I can't go into details, but let's just say that we've both been through some really difficult times," she replied, her voice trembling. I didn't press her for more information, but her words left a lingering sense of unease. I couldn't help but wonder what kind of trauma had brought Sarah and John together, and what dark secret she was hiding beneath her quiet demeanor. Over the following weeks, I began to notice subtle changes in Sarah's behavior. She would often startle easily, her eyes darting around the room as if expecting danger to strike at any moment. Her cheerful moments with John grew fewer, replaced by long periods of brooding silence. One evening, as I was in my room working on a project, I overheard a heated argument between Sarah and John in the living room. Their voices were raised and I couldn't make out the words, but the tension in the air was palpable. It was the first time I had witnessed such a dispute between them, and it left me with a growing sense of concern. The following morning, I ran into John in the kitchen. He looked exhausted, his eyes bloodshot from what appeared to be a sleepless night. "Is everything okay with you and Sarah?" I asked cautiously. John sighed, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "We've been going through a rough patch lately," he admitted. "Sarah's been dealing with some personal demons, and it's been taking a toll on both of us." I wanted to offer my support, to reach out to Sarah and let her know that she wasn't alone, but I didn't know how to breach the subject without intruding on their privacy. Instead, I decided to keep a watchful eye on the situation, hoping that things would eventually improve. As the days turned into weeks, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong with Sarah. She had become increasingly withdrawn, rarely leaving the apartment except for her support group meetings. I had tried to strike up casual conversations with her, but she would respond with one-word answers, her eyes haunted by a deep sadness. One evening, as I was returning from work, I found Sarah sitting alone her eyes fixed on the flickering television screen. Her gaze was distant, and she appeared lost in a world of her own. "Sarah, are you okay?" I asked, genuinely concerned. She turned to look at me, her eyes welling with tears. "I can't do this anymore, Alex," she whispered, her voice filled with anguish. I sat down next to her, offering a comforting presence. "Do what, Sarah? You can talk to me." She hesitated for a moment, as if wrestling with her thoughts. Then, in a trembling voice, she began to reveal her dark secret. "I've been living in fear for years," she confessed, her words heavy with pain. "There's someone from my past, a dangerous person who's been haunting me. I thought I could escape, start a new life with John, but he's found me. And now he's threatening to destroy everything I hold dear." I listened in shock as Sarah recounted a harrowing tale of abuse, manipulation, and a relentless pursuit by a figure from her past. She had been forced to change her identity, move to a different city, and join the support group to escape the tormentor who had haunted her for so long. Tears streamed down her face as she spoke, and I could see the terror in her eyes. It was a story of unimaginable suffering, and I couldn't help but feel a deep sympathy for her. "Why haven't you gone to the police?" I asked, my concern growing. Sarah's expression turned to one of sheer terror. "I can't," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "He's always been one step ahead of me. If he finds out that I've gone to the police, he'll stop at nothing to find me. I can't put John or anyone else in danger." I realized that Sarah was trapped in a living nightmare, unable to escape the dark shadow of her past. It was a chilling revelation, and I knew that I had to do everything in my power to help her. Over the next few days, I worked with Sarah to develop a plan to ensure her safety. We installed security measures in our apartment, changed her routines, and she began attending therapy sessions to address the trauma she had endured. It was a small glimmer of hope in an otherwise bleak situation. But as we delved deeper into the intricacies of Sarah's past, it became clear that her tormentor was growing increasingly relentless. Strange and threatening messages would appear on our doorstep, and we would occasionally spot a shadowy figure lurking in the shadows near our building. The situation reached a breaking point one fateful night. John had gone out to run an errand, leaving Sarah and me alone in the apartment. As we sat in the living room, the lights suddenly went out, plunging us into darkness. Fear clenched at my chest as I fumbled for my phone to use as a flashlight. I could hear Sarah's rapid breathing, and I knew that we were not alone in the apartment. The sound of shuffling footsteps echoed through the darkness, drawing nearer with each passing moment. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows, bathed in the dim glow of my phone's flashlight. It was a man, tall and menacing, with a look of malevolence in his eyes. He advanced toward us, a chilling smile on his lips. "Sarah, you can't hide from me," he hissed, his voice dripping with malice. I sprang into action, doing my best to shield Sarah from the intruder. With a surge of adrenaline, I managed to push him back and slam the door shut, locking it securely. "Call the police," I told Sarah urgently, as I braced the door with all my strength. Sarah dialed 911, and I could hear her shaky voice as she relayed our terrifying situation to the dispatcher. Meanwhile, the intruder pounded on the door, his threats growing more unhinged by the second. Minutes felt like hours as we waited for the police to arrive. The intruder continued his relentless assault on the door, and I could feel my strength waning. Just when it seemed like he might break through, the sound of sirens filled the air and the intruder fled into the night. The police arrived, taking our statements and promising to investigate the incident. It was a small victory, but it came at a great cost. Sarah was traumatized by the encounter, and the fear that had consumed her for so long had now become a horrifying reality. In the days that followed, Sarah and John decided to relocate to a different city, hoping to escape the relentless tormentor who had haunted their lives. I helped them pack their belongings and wished them well, hoping that the distance would finally provide them with the safety and peace they deserved. As I watched them drive away, I couldn't help but reflect on the darkness that can lurk beneath the surface of seemingly ordinary lives. Sarah's ordeal had been a stark reminder that the past can cast a long shadow, one that can engulf even the most promising futures. I returned to my apartment, grateful that Sarah and John were safe, but haunted by the knowledge that their tormentor was still out there, lurking in the shadows. It was a chilling reminder that sometimes, the darkest secrets are the ones that threaten to consume us whole, and that even in the face of unimaginable fear, there is always a glimmer of hope. And so as I settled back into my quiet, unassuming life, I couldn't help but wonder how many other individuals were living with their own dark secrets, how many others were grappling with the shadows of their pasts. It was a sobering thought, a reminder that we never truly know the demons that may be lurking just beneath the surface. Story 2. The chill of autumn had settled into our small college town, and with it came the promise of new beginnings. I was excited to start my freshman year at Crestwood University, eager to make friends and explore the world beyond my hometown. Little did I know that the darkest, most unsettling chapter of my life was about to unfold within the walls of my dormitory. My roommate Mark seemed like an ordinary guy at first. He was friendly, always willing to help with my heavy bags during move-in day, and he even offered to share his stash of snacks. We hit it off quickly, bonding over our shared love of horror movies and late-night gaming sessions. Everything was perfect, or so I thought. As the weeks passed, I began to notice odd things about Mark. He was a night owl, staying up until the early hours of the morning. I'd often wake to find him hunched over his desk, staring at his computer screen with an intensity that creeped me out. I tried not to think too much of it, chalking it up to his eccentric study habits. One evening, curiosity got the better of me. Mark had left his laptop open, and I couldn't resist taking a peek. What I saw made my blood run cold. His screen was filled with newspaper articles and photographs of missing persons, each one carefully cataloged with notes. My heart raced as I realized the extent of his obsession. "Mark, what is all of this?" I asked, my voice trembling as I confronted him about the disturbing discovery. He turned to face me, his eyes devoid of emotion. "Just a hobby," he replied casually, as if discussing the weather. "I'm interested in unsolved mysteries, that's all." But it wasn't just the obsession with missing persons that unnerved me. Mark's behavior grew increasingly erratic. He would disappear for days on end, claiming he was visiting his family or taking impromptu trips. Whenever he returned, he'd bring back strange, unmarked packages that he stashed in the depths of our closet. I tried to distance myself from Mark, spending more time with my new friends on campus, but he always managed to pull me back into his world. He'd invite me to movie nights or offer me his snacks, and I'd find myself unable to refuse. It was as though he had some strange power over me, a magnetic pull I couldn't resist. One evening after a particularly long gaming session, I couldn't hold back my questions any longer. "Mark, what are those packages you keep bringing back? And why do you always leave in the middle of the night?" He grinned a chilling, predatory smile. "I have a secret," he whispered, his voice laced with menace. "But I can't tell you just yet. You'll find out soon enough." I should have run then, fled from the darkness that seemed to envelop my roommate. But fear held me captive, and I couldn't tear myself away from the web he'd woven around me. Weeks turned into months, and the campus buzzed with rumors of missing students. It was as if our peaceful college town had become a breeding ground for tragedy. I couldn't help but connect the dots, wondering if Mark's obsession with missing persons had taken a sinister turn. One night, as I lay in bed unable to sleep, I heard the creaking of our closet door. My heart pounded in my chest as I watched in horror as Mark emerged, carrying one of the mysterious packages. He didn't notice me, too consumed by whatever dark purpose drove him. I watched in terror as he unwrapped the package, revealing a collection of photographs, all of them featuring me. Each image had been taken without my knowledge, capturing intimate moments from my life. Fear gripped me as I realized that I was at the center of his obsession. "Mark, what the hell is this?" I screamed, my voice trembling with rage and fear. He turned to face me, his eyes filled with a manic intensity. "You see, I have a secret and you're a part of it," he hissed. I knew I had to escape, to run as far away from Mark as possible. I leaped out of bed and bolted for the door, but he was faster, tackling me to the ground. We grappled on the floor, my fear-fueled strength matching his desperation. As we struggled, Mark's words spilled out in a frenzied confession. He had been responsible for the disappearances on campus, luring unsuspecting students into his twisted web. He had been studying me, preparing for the day when I would become his next victim. With every ounce of strength, I managed to break free from his grip and make a run for it. I dashed out of the room, the chilling echo of his maniacal laughter following me down the dormitory hallway. My mind raced as I fled, knowing that I had narrowly escaped a fate worse than death. I reached the campus security office, breathless and covered in bruises. They took my statement and launched an immediate search for Mark. As they combed through his room, they discovered a chilling array of evidence, including photographs and personal items belonging to his victims. Mark was apprehended, and the truth of his dark secret was laid bare for all to see. He had been living a double life, posing as an ordinary college student while hiding a sinister obsession with abducting and tormenting his fellow classmates. In the aftermath, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had taken hold of me. The scars, both physical and emotional, ran deep, a constant reminder of the horrors I had narrowly escaped. Crestwood University would never be the same, and neither would I. As the seasons changed and the years passed, I found solace in therapy and the support of my friends and family. Mark was locked away, never to harm another soul, but the nightmares of that fateful year would haunt me forever. The darkness that had once resided within my own dormitory had been exposed, but the true nature of Mark's secret would forever remain a chilling mystery, one that I hoped would fade into obscurity, never to be unearthed again. But the story didn't end with Mark's capture. As the investigation deepened, the authorities discovered a network of hidden chambers beneath our dormitory, each one containing evidence of Mark's depraved activities. The underground lair was a chilling maze of photographs, journals, and mementos, each one linked to a different victim. It became clear that Mark had been operating in secret for years, selecting his victims with disturbing precision. He had meticulously documented their lives, collecting information and mementos that allowed him to assume their identities. It was a nightmare beyond comprehension, a secret so dark and twisted that it defied explanation. The campus was in shock, and the media descended upon Crestwood University, hungry for every detail of the horrifying discovery. Students and their families demanded answers, and the university was forced to confront the unthinkable truth that had festered beneath their very noses. As the investigation continued, more victims were identified, and the full scope of Mark's crimes became clear. Families were reunited with their missing loved ones, but the scars of their ordeals ran deep. Crestwood University would never fully recover from the stain of Mark's actions, and the dormitory where the nightmare had unfolded was forever tainted. In the years that followed, I tried to move on with my life, but the memories of that fateful year continued to haunt me. I couldn't escape the feeling of being watched, of a darkness that lingered in the corners of my mind. The nightmares persisted, a relentless reminder of the horror I had endured. As I walked the halls of Crestwood University, I couldn't help but wonder how many other secrets lay hidden beneath the surface, how many other nightmares were waiting to be uncovered. The campus had been forever changed by the darkness that had taken root within its walls, a darkness that had nearly claimed me as its victim. The legacy of Mark's dark secret would cast a long shadow over Crestwood University, a chilling reminder that even in the most ordinary of places, the most sinister of secrets could be lurking, waiting to be revealed. And so, as I looked out at the campus that had once been a place of promise and hope, I couldn't help but wonder if the darkness that had consumed Mark might one day resurface, casting its sinister shadow once again. Story 3. I had always thought of myself as someone who could handle life's twists and turns with ease. After all, I had weathered my fair share of ups and downs over the years. But nothing could have prepared me for the peculiar turn my life would take when I moved in with my new roommate, Alex. It was a sweltering summer day when I first met Alex. I had been searching for a roommate to share the rent of my small 2-bedroom apartment, and he had responded to my online ad. We met at a nearby cafe, and our initial conversation was pleasant enough. Alex was a tall, wiry man in his early 30s, with a mop of unruly brown hair and an awkward but endearing smile. We quickly agreed to become roommates. His rent payment would be a lifesaver for me, and Alex assured me that he was quiet and kept to himself, which sounded like a dream come true for a roommate. Little did I know that his reserved demeanor would soon unravel into a series of bizarre and unsettling behaviors. The first sign that something was amiss came in the form of late-night noises. At first, I chalked it up to the usual settling sounds of an old apartment building. But as the weeks went by, the noises became more distinct and scary. I would hear faint whispers and soft thumps in the middle of the night, as if Alex were engaged in some mysterious nocturnal activity. One night, unable to ignore it any longer, I ventured out of my room to investigate. I found Alex sitting cross-legged in the living room, surrounded by an array of candles. He was hunched over a worn, leather-bound book, muttering incantations in a language I couldn't recognize. His eyes were wide, unblinking, and filled with an intensity that made my blood freeze. "Alex, what are you doing?" I stammered, my voice trembling with a mix of fear and confusion. He looked up at me, his eyes momentarily vacant, before a twisted smile crept across his face. "Just some late-night reading," he replied cryptically before closing the book and extinguishing the candles. I returned to my room, my heart pounding in my chest. The encounter had left me deeply unsettled, but I convinced myself that it was nothing more than an eccentric habit, a quirk that I could tolerate in a roommate. As the weeks turned into months, Alex's behavior grew increasingly erratic. He would spend hours locked in his room, and when he emerged, he would be carrying strange items, a taxidermy crow, an antique dagger, and even a collection of unmarked vials filled with murky liquids. I had no idea what he was doing with these items, but it was clear that he was immersed in some bizarre and unsettling hobby. One evening, I returned home from work to find our living room transformed into a makeshift altar. Candles, incense, and strange symbols were scattered across the floor. Alex was kneeling at the center, his eyes closed in what appeared to be deep meditation. "Alex, what is all of this?" I demanded, my frustration and anxiety boiling over. He opened his eyes slowly, gazing at me with a scary calmness. "I'm pursuing a higher purpose," he replied, his voice carrying an otherworldly quality. "I've found a path to enlightenment, and I must follow it." I couldn't make sense of his cryptic words, and a sense of dread settled over me. It was as if Alex had ventured into a world of his own, one that was steeped in mysticism and darkness. I couldn't fathom what had led him down this path or how it had taken hold of him so completely. As the days turned into weeks, I became increasingly isolated in my own home. Alex's presence loomed over me like a dark cloud, and I couldn't escape the feeling that he was hiding something far more sinister than his eccentric hobbies. It was as though a wall had been erected between us, and I was left on the outside, trying to peer in and make sense of the madness that had consumed my roommate. One night, unable to sleep, I decided to investigate further. I carefully picked the lock to Alex's room and ventured inside. What I discovered would haunt me for the rest of my days. The walls of his room were covered in intricate symbols, drawn in what appeared to be blood. Shelves were lined with ancient-looking books, each one filled with cryptic texts and illustrations of grotesque creatures. The air was heavy with the scent of incense, and in the center of the room I found a circle etched into the floor, surrounded by candles and adorned with disturbing symbols. As I inspected the room, I stumbled upon a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards. Inside, I found a collection of journals, each one filled with Alex's ramblings and accounts of his bizarre experiences. He wrote of visions of encounters with entities from other realms, and of a growing obsession with the occult. My heart raced as I realized the depth of Alex's descent into madness. It was clear that he had become entangled in a world of dark magic and forbidden knowledge, and there was no telling where it would lead him, or what it might mean for me. Terrified and unsure of what to do, I confronted Alex about what I had discovered. His reaction was unlike anything I could have anticipated. He laughed, a chilling, mirthless laugh. "You've stumbled upon the truth, my friend," he said, his eyes gleaming with a manic intensity. "I've unlocked the secrets of the universe, and there's no turning back." I knew then that I had to escape, to flee from the madness that had consumed my roommate. I packed my belongings hastily and made plans to move out. But as I prepared to leave, I couldn't shake the feeling that Alex's dark obsession would follow me, that I had become entangled in a web of darkness that would never let me go. As I settled into my new apartment, far away from the nightmare of my old life, I couldn't help but wonder what had become of Alex. Had his obsession with the occult consumed him completely, or had he found some semblance of peace? I would never know the answers, but the memory of those eerie nights in our shared apartment would haunt me forever. I had learned a valuable lesson about the darkness that can lurk within the hearts and minds of those we think we know. It was a lesson that would stay with me, a reminder that sometimes the most unsettling and inexplicable mysteries can be found closer to home than we ever imagined. In the years that followed, I tried to put the nightmare of my former roommate behind me, to move on with my life and leave the darkness that had consumed him far behind. But I couldn't escape the feeling that some part of that darkness had latched onto me, that I had become a part of a story that was far from over. And so, as I looked out at the world, I couldn't help but wonder how many other individuals were hiding their own dark secrets, how many others were on the brink of a descent into madness and obsession. The line between reality and the unknown was thinner than I had ever imagined, and I couldn't help but fear what lurked on the other side. Working at Walmart was never glamorous, but it paid the bills. I was just an ordinary employee, one among the sea of blue vests, stacking shelves and dealing with the quirks of everyday customers. The store was a monotonous place, predictable and unchanging. That was until I started working under Manager Phillips. Manager Phillips was a tall, middle-aged man with graying hair and an unassuming demeanor. He wasn't particularly friendly, but he wasn't unkind either. He ran the store efficiently, and that's what mattered to most of us. However, there was something about him that made me uneasy from the very beginning. It started with the way he looked at us, his employees. His gaze was penetrating, as if he were trying to read our souls. It was a look that lingered too long, that made you want to squirm and look away. But I couldn't deny the effectiveness of his management style. Our store was running like a well-oiled machine, and our sales numbers were steadily climbing. One day, as I was restocking the canned goods aisle, I overheard a hushed conversation between two of my co-workers, Rachel and Mike. They were whispering about Manager Phillips and the strange things they had seen him do. My curiosity got the better of me, and I moved closer to eavesdrop. "He's always in the break room during his lunch break," Rachel said, her voice barely audible. "And he locks the door behind him." Mike nodded in agreement. "Yeah, and I've seen him go out to the parking lot late at night, sometimes after everyone else has left. It's weird, man. I had noticed some odd behaviors from Manager Phillips myself, but I had brushed them off as quirks. Now, hearing my coworkers' concerns, I couldn't help but wonder if there was more to the man than met the eye. That evening, after my shift, I decided to follow Manager Phillips. It was a foolish and impulsive decision, driven by a curiosity I couldn't ignore. I watched from my car as he left the store, his figure disappearing into the night. I trailed him at a distance, my heart pounding in my chest. He drove to a remote area outside of town, a place I had never been before. He parked his car near a secluded pond, and I watched as he got out and walked to the water's edge. In the dim moonlight, I saw him raise his hands, palms up, and begin to speak in a low, almost hypnotic voice. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone of his voice was dark and cold. It was as though he were engaged in some kind of ritual. I watched in stunned silence as Manager Phillips continued his strange behavior. He stayed by the pond for what felt like hours, his movements deliberate and purposeful. It was clear that whatever he was doing was deeply important to him. Finally, he returned to his car and drove back to the store, seemingly unaware that he had been observed. I waited a few minutes before I followed him back, my mind racing with questions and suspicions. Over the next few weeks, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong with Manager Phillips. I kept a close eye on his actions, documenting the strange occurrences I witnessed. It became an obsession, something I couldn't let go of. One day, I decided to confide in Rachel and Mike, the co-workers I had overheard earlier. I told them about what I had seen at the pond, and they shared their own observations. It was clear that we all had a growing sense of unease about our manager. Rachel had noticed that Manager Phillips seemed to have an uncanny ability to predict when the store would be busy or when a major sale would occur. It was as though he had insider information that the rest of us didn't. Mike, on the other hand, had discovered that Manager Phillips had access to a room in the back of the store that no one else did. It was a small, windowless space, and the door was always locked. Mike had tried to ask about it, but Manager Phillips had brushed off his inquiries, claiming it was simply a storage room. As our suspicions grew, we decided to do some digging. We scoured the store's records and discovered that there were financial irregularities that seemed to be connected to Manager Phillips. Money was unaccounted for, and inventory seemed to vanish mysteriously. It was as though the store was bleeding money, and Manager Phillips was at the center of it all. One evening, as we were discussing our findings, Rachel had a breakthrough. She had been looking into Manager Phillips's background and had discovered that he had a history of involvement with a secretive and obscure religious group. The group's beliefs were unconventional, to say the least, and its members were known for their eccentric rituals. It all clicked into place. Manager Phillips' strange behavior, his ability to predict the store's fortunes, the locked room, and now his connection to this enigmatic religious group. It was all part of a puzzle that we were determined to solve. We decided to confront Manager Phillips with our suspicions. We confronted him in his office one evening, armed with our evidence and the determination to uncover the truth. He listened to us calmly, his expression unreadable. When we presented our findings, his only response was a chilling smile. "You've been very observant, haven't you?" he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "But you have no idea what you're getting into." We demanded answers, but Manager Phillips refused to divulge anything more. Instead, he warned us to drop our investigation and forget everything we had discovered. It was a veiled threat, and we knew we were treading on dangerous ground. Undeterred, we decided to take our concerns to higher-ups in the company. We believed that they needed to know about Manager Phillips's behavior and its impact on the store's finances. We gathered our evidence and prepared to make our case. But before we could take our concerns any further, things took a sinister turn. Rachel disappeared one night after her shift. She had been conducting her own investigation into Manager Phillips, and we feared that she had crossed a line that put her in danger. We reported her disappearance to the police, but there was no sign of her. It was as though she had vanished without a trace, leaving us with a growing sense of dread and helplessness. Mike and I were now the only ones left to unravel the mystery of Manager Phillips. We knew that we were risking our own safety, but we couldn't turn back. We had to uncover the truth, not only for Rachel's sake, but for our own as well. We continued to gather evidence, documenting every irregularity and suspicious behavior we could find. The financial discrepancies grew more alarming, and it became clear that Manager Phillips was siphoning money from the store for reasons known only to him. One night, as I was going through some old records in the break room, I discovered something creeped me out. I found a photo of Manager Phillips with a group of people, all dressed in robes, standing in front of a dark, imposing building. It was the same building I had seen in my dreams, the one that haunted me with its foreboding presence. The photo was old, faded, but there was no mistaking Manager Phillips's face among the group. It was as though he had a connection to that sinister place. I showed the photo to Mike and he recognized the building as well. It was located on the outskirts of town, and it had always been associated with rumors of strange rituals and secretive gatherings. With this new piece of evidence, we decided to investigate the building ourselves. We couldn't ignore the possibility that it held the key to uncovering Manager Phillips's dark secret. Late one night, we drove to the location, our hearts pounding with anticipation and fear. The building loomed before us, a dark and imposing structure that seemed to radiate malevolence. We knew we were walking into the unknown, and we were prepared for whatever we might find. As we entered the building, the air grew cold and the silence was oppressive. We made our way through a cloudy lit hallway, our flashlights cutting through the darkness. The building was filled with strange symbols and markings, and the walls seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy. Finally, we reached a large, cavernous chamber, and what we saw inside made our blood run cold. Manager Phillips stood at the center of the room, surrounded by a group of robed figures. They were engaged in a ritual, their voices raised in a chant. In the center of the room was an altar, and on it lay a figure covered by a black shroud. It was Rachel, unconscious and seemingly lifeless. Manager Phillips was overseeing the ritual, his eyes filled with a manic intensity. We watched in horror as the ritual reached its climax. The figures chanted louder, and the air crackled with an unnatural energy. And then the unthinkable happened. Rachel's body began to twitch and convulse, and she let out a haunting scream. It was as though she were being possessed by some dark force. We couldn't bear to watch any longer, and we turned to flee. But before we could escape, we were discovered by Manager Phillips and his followers. They cornered us in the chamber, their eyes filled with a fanatic zeal. Manager Phillips spoke in a voice that was not his own, his words filled with an eerie resonance. He revealed the true nature of his secret, a pact with a sinister entity that granted him power and knowledge beyond comprehension. He offered us a choice: join him in his dark endeavors or become sacrifices to the entity he served. We refused to submit to his twisted desires, and a battle ensued. It was a desperate struggle for our lives, as we fought against Manager Phillips and his followers, determined to stop their sinister ritual. As we grappled with them, we managed to disrupt the ritual, freeing Rachel from the entity's grip. She was weakened and traumatized, but she was alive. In the end, we managed to escape the building, leaving Manager Phillips and his followers behind. We reported the incident to the police, but they found no trace of the manager or his group when they arrived at the scene. The experience left us scarred and haunted, but we knew that we had done the right thing. We had uncovered Manager Phillips's dark secret and put an end to his dark plans. We never returned to that Walmart store, and we never saw Manager Phillips again. But the memory of that night, of the sinister rituals and dark entity, would haunt us for the rest of our lives. As we moved on, we couldn't help but wonder how many other secrets were hidden in the most ordinary of places, waiting to be discovered by those brave or foolish enough to seek them out. The world was full of mysteries, some more terrifying than we could ever imagine, and we had come face to face with one of them. Story 2. It was an ordinary Tuesday evening when I decided to make a quick trip to Walmart. The sun had already dipped below the horizon, casting the sprawling parking lot into darkness. A flickering streetlight hummed above me as I exited my car. I shook it off as a result of the chilly autumn air, reminding myself that Walmart was just a stone's throw away, and I'd be inside the well-lit store in no time. I strolled through the automatic sliding doors, greeted by the familiar overhead hum of fluorescent lights and the sight of endless aisles filled with products of every kind. There's something oddly comforting about the predictability of Walmart even at night. Rows of neatly stacked shelves, the faint smell of plastic and cleaning supplies, the muffled chatter of employees and late-night shoppers. It was all so ordinary. I had come for a few essentials, so I grabbed a shopping cart and began to browse. The soft squeaking of wheels echoed around me as I navigated through the labyrinthine aisles. My footsteps seemed unusually loud against the linoleum floor, but I shrugged it off as my imagination playing tricks on me. I picked up a box of cereal, some milk, and a few other items, steadily making my way toward the checkout lanes. As I turned into the snack aisle, something caught my eye. A man in a faded green hoodie. He was standing near the potato chips, his head buried in a bag as if he were genuinely shopping. At first, there was nothing remarkable about him, just another shopper in a Walmart hoodie. But then, something about his posture struck me as odd. He seemed tense, like a predator sizing up its prey. He didn't glance my way, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching me, studying me. It made my blood freeze, making me hesitate. I continued down the aisle, glancing over my shoulder to find him still there, pretending to examine bags of chips. I quickened my pace, now acutely aware of my surroundings. Every aisle I turned into, he was there, never too close but always within my line of sight. Panic started to creep in, and I told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe he was just doing his shopping and I was reading too much into it. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. When I reached the personal care aisle, I decided to test my theory. I grabbed a random item off the shelf, a bottle of shampoo I didn't even need, and headed for the electronics section. If he was following me, he'd have to reveal his true intentions. Sure enough, as I entered the electronics section, he followed. I tried to act nonchalant, glancing at the TVs and browsing the video games, but my heart raced. There was no doubt now he was following me. Fear constricted my chest as I considered my options. I couldn't confront him directly. I needed help. I reached for my phone, but a quick glance told me I had no signal. Walmart's notorious dead spots, I thought. Panic set in as I realized I was on my own. I decided to make a beeline for the front of the store, where there were always employees at the registers. The man could be a harmless coincidence, but my gut told me otherwise. I picked up the pace, my cart squeaking loudly in protest. I passed through the clothing section, then the home goods aisle, but he stayed with me, never more than a few aisles away. I could feel his eyes on me, and I knew he was closing in. Finally, I reached the main thoroughfare of the store, lined with registers and manned by Walmart employees. I hurriedly pushed my cart toward the closest checkout lane, relief washing over me. The cashier, a young woman with a friendly smile, scanned my items and made small talk as she worked. But just as I was starting to calm down, I saw him. The man in the green hoodie was standing a few lanes away, pretending to examine a display of candy bars. He wasn't shopping. He was watching me, waiting for his chance. I paid for my items, thanked the cashier, and made a quick decision. Instead of heading for the exit, I turned and pushed my cart toward the pharmacy section at the back of the store. It was further away from the entrance, but it was also less crowded, and I hoped I could lose him there. As I walked, I took a deep breath and tried to think rationally. I needed to find a store employee and alert them to the situation. I knew I couldn't confront this man on my own. But where were the employees? It was as if the store had emptied out, leaving only me and the stalker. I turned a corner and entered the pharmacy area. It was eerily quiet, with only the soft hum of fluorescent lights above. I scanned the rows of medicine and health products, desperately searching for a store employee. There was no one in sight. I felt a cold sweat forming on my brow as I continued to push my cart. My heart pounded in my chest, and every sound, every shadow, seemed amplified. The man in the green hoodie was still behind me, closer now, his footsteps echoing ominously on the linoleum floor. I rounded another corner and my heart sank. There, standing in front of me, was a display of Halloween masks and costumes. Rows of plastic faces leered at me, grotesque and terrifying. The irony of the situation hit me. The scariest thing in the store wasn't a mask, it was the man following me. I knew I couldn't keep running forever. My phone still had no signal and there were no store employees in sight. I had to make a stand, find a way to escape this nightmare. I glanced around, searching for anything that could help me. That's when I saw it, a fire extinguisher mounted on the wall. It was my only chance. I approached it, trying to remain calm. The man was now just a few feet away, his eyes locked on me, a sinister grin playing on his lips. With a surge of adrenaline, I grabbed the fire extinguisher and aimed it at him. "Stay back," I shouted, my voice quivering but determined. The man froze, his grin fading into a look of surprise. Whoa, calm down," he said, holding up his hands. "I'm not here to hurt you." I wasn't convinced. "Then why are you following me?" I demanded, my finger on the extinguisher's trigger. He hesitated for a moment, then sighed. "I'm not following you. I work here, in loss prevention. I thought you might be a shoplifter." My heart pounded in my chest as I considered his words. Could he be telling the truth? I lowered the fire extinguisher slightly, but I didn't put it down. "You're a Walmart employee?" I asked, still on edge. "Yes," he replied, his hands still raised. "I'm just doing my job, trying to prevent theft. I'm sorry if I scared you." I looked around, finally noticing the security cameras placed throughout the store. It made sense. He was an employee trying to protect the store's assets. I felt a wave of embarrassment wash over me as I realized my mistake. I thought you were stalking me," I admitted, feeling foolish. He nodded sympathetically. "I can see how it might have looked that way. I should have introduced myself and explained, but I didn't want to blow my cover." Relief flooded through me as I lowered the fire extinguisher completely and handed it back to him. "I'm sorry for overreacting," I said, my voice shaky. "It's just that, well, it's been a really strange night." He offered a friendly smile. "No worries. I'm Chris, by the way. I promise I won't be following you anymore." We both chuckled nervously, and I finally started to relax. Chris walked me to the front of the store where other employees were now visible at the registers. He explained the situation to a manager who assured me they would review the security footage to confirm everything was okay. As I left the store, I couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity of it all. What had started as a routine trip to Walmart had turned into a terrifying ordeal, all because of a misunderstanding. I realized that sometimes fear can distort our perceptions and lead us to make rash decisions. From that night on, I never looked at Walmart the same way. It was no longer just a place to shop. It was a reminder that even the most ordinary settings can become the backdrop for a terrifying encounter. And as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that the man in the green hoodie had given me a glimpse into the darker side of the ordinary world. A world where shadows lurked in every aisle, and fear could turn even the most mundane moments into a nightmare. Story 3. Working the night shift at Walmart was never the highlight of my week. The sterile fluorescent lights seemed to drain the life out of everything, casting harsh shadows that danced eerily on the linoleum floor. But the pay was decent, and it was a job, so I couldn't complain too much. One particular night, as the clock ticked closer to midnight, I found myself manning the customer service desk. It wasn't a particularly exciting job. I spent most of my time handling returns and dealing with the occasional irate customer. But that night was different, as I would soon discover. I had just finished processing a return when I saw him. He stood at the entrance, lingering in the faint-lit vestibule. His silhouette was framed by the automatic sliding doors, and something about him immediately sent a shiver down my spine. The man was tall and gaunt, his features obscured by the hood of his tattered coat. He wore dark, worn-out jeans that seemed to sag under their own weight, and his shoes were scuffed and filthy. But what really caught my attention were his eyes, or rather the lack of them. His face was hidden in the shadows, and I couldn't make out any facial features, just two dark voids where his eyes should have been. I blinked, thinking it was a trick of the light, but when I looked again, his unsettling gaze remained. It was as though he had no eyes at all, just empty sockets staring into the store. I felt a freezing sensation, and I couldn't tear my gaze away from him. As the automatic doors slid shut behind him, he stepped into the store, his footsteps almost inaudible on the polished floor. I watched in a mix of curiosity and unease as he moved deeper into the store, his hooded head bowed slightly as if in contemplation. I quickly glanced around the store to see if any of my coworkers had noticed the strange man, but they were all busy with their tasks, oblivious to his presence. Part of me wanted to alert someone, call security, or at least keep an eye on him, but another part of me hesitated, unsure of what to make of the situation. After all, he was just a customer, albeit a peculiar one. I decided to keep an eye on him from the customer service desk, rationalizing that it was my job to monitor the store. As I watched, he wandered aimlessly through the aisles, occasionally picking up an item, only to put it back haphazardly. His movements were jerky, almost mechanical, and there was an unsettling air of purposelessness about him. Time seemed to stretch as I observed him, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was profoundly wrong. It was as though he didn't belong here, as if he were a glitch in the system, an anomaly in the orderly world of Walmart. As the minutes turned into hours, the store grew quieter, and the few remaining customers hurried through their shopping, eager to leave. The man, however, remained, seemingly unfazed by the late hour. It was almost as if he were waiting for something or someone. I watched him for what felt like an eternity, my unease growing with each passing moment. Then, to my surprise, he abruptly stopped in front of the customer service desk, his empty gaze fixed on me. My heart pounded in my chest as I met his eyeless stare, and a cold sweat formed on my brow. "Can I help you with something?" I asked, my voice quivering slightly. He didn't respond. Instead, he extended a bony hand, the fingers unnaturally long and thin, and placed a crumpled piece of paper on the counter. I cautiously picked it up and unfolded it, my eyes widening in shock as I read the scrawled message. "They're coming for you." My heart raced and I looked up at the man, my mind racing with fear and confusion. "Who's coming for me?" I demanded, my voice trembling. The man remained silent, his hooded head still bowed. I felt a growing sense of dread, as though I had stumbled into a nightmare from which there was no escape. I decided to call for help. I picked up the store phone and dialed the security extension, but there was no answer, just static on the line. Panic welled up inside me as I realized I was on my own, with this mysterious man who seemed to defy reason. I glanced around, hoping to catch the attention of one of my coworkers, but they were all preoccupied with their tasks, oblivious to the tension that had gripped the store. It was as if I were trapped in a parallel reality, isolated with this enigmatic stranger. I turned my attention back to the man who had now stepped closer to the desk, his hood concealing his face even more. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice quivering. He finally spoke, his voice low and raspy, sending a shiver down my spine. "I am a harbinger of the inevitable," he said cryptically. I didn't know what to make of his words, but they filled me with a sense of foreboding. "What do you want from me?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He reached into the pocket of his coat and pulled out a small, worn-out photograph. He slid it across the counter toward me, and my hands trembled as I picked it up. The photograph was old and faded, depicting a group of people standing in front of a dilapidated house. It looked like it had been taken decades ago. Among the people in the photo, one figure stood out, the man himself, his face whole, his eyes filled with life. I looked up at him, my confusion deepening. "Is this you?" He nodded slowly. It was once. I couldn't make sense of it. The man in the photograph bore no resemblance to the eyeless, hooded figure before me. "What happened to you?" I asked, my curiosity overcoming my fear. He didn't answer directly, instead choosing to speak in riddles. "I have seen the depths of the abyss, tasted the darkness that lies beyond the veil of reality. I have glimpsed the true nature of existence, and it has taken everything from me." I didn't know what to say. His words were both cryptic and unsettling, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I had stumbled upon something beyond my understanding. Suddenly, the store's intercom crackled to life, the sound echoing through the empty aisles. "Attention Walmart associates," a voice announced. "We have received a report of a suspicious individual in the store. Please be on the lookout and report any unusual activity to security." My heart sank as I realized the announcement was about the man standing before me. I had to act quickly. I grabbed the phone and dialed the security extension again, hoping someone would pick up this time. To my relief, a voice answered on the other end. "Security, what's your emergency?" I quickly explained the situation, the strange man, the cryptic message, and the unsettling photograph. The security officer assured me they would dispatch someone immediately. As I hung up the phone, I turned to the man who had remained strangely calm throughout the ordeal. "Security is on their way," I said, my voice trembling. "You need to stay here until they arrive." He nodded, seemingly unfazed by the impending arrival of security. "I will wait," he said softly. Minutes felt like hours as I stood behind the customer service desk, the man standing before me, his hooded head bowed in contemplation. The store remained eerily quiet, the harsh fluorescent lights casting long shadows that seemed to dance in rhythm with my racing heart. Finally, the sound of approaching footsteps broke the silence. 2 security officers clad in blue uniforms entered the store, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. I rushed to meet them, explaining the situation and pointing to the mysterious man. The security officers approached the man cautiously, their flashlights illuminating his hooded face. They exchanged wary glances as they questioned him, but he remained cryptic and evasive, offering no concrete answers. As the officers handcuffed him and led him away, I couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. The ordeal was over, and I could finally breathe easy. But even as I watched him being escorted out of the store, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story, that the man's enigmatic words held a deeper meaning. Days turned into weeks, and the memory of that unsettling night at Walmart began to fade. Life returned to its usual routine, and I tried to put the bizarre encounter behind me. Then one evening, as I was leaving work, I found a small envelope waiting for me at the customer service desk. It was addressed to me in handwriting I didn't recognize. I cautiously opened it and found a single piece of paper inside, along with another faded photograph. The photograph depicted the same group of people standing in front of the dilapidated house. But there was something different about it. The man who had been eyeless in the previous photograph now had eyes, dark and piercing, staring into the camera with an intensity that sent a shiver down my spine. On the back of the photograph, a message was scrawled in the same handwriting as the envelope. "The abyss is patient. It waits for those who seek to understand its secrets. Beware the truths you seek, for they may consume you." I couldn't make sense of it. Who had sent me this message, and what did it mean? The enigmatic encounter at Walmart had left me with more questions than answers, and I couldn't escape the feeling that I had stumbled upon something beyond my comprehension. As I left the store that evening, the harsh fluorescent lights casting long shadows around me, I couldn't help but wonder what other mysteries lay hidden in the most ordinary of places, waiting to be discovered by those brave or foolish enough to seek them out. My name is Alex Holloway, and I never believed in ghosts until I moved into Hollywood House. I had inherited the old Victorian mansion from a distant relative I'd never met. The news of my sudden inheritance came as a shock, but the prospect of living in such a grand, historic house excited me. Little did I know that the house came with a history that would test the very limits of my skepticism. I had always considered myself a rational, level-headed person. I was an engineer by profession, and I approached life with a practical and analytical mindset. Ghost stories were nothing more than tales told around campfires designed to scare and amuse. But that was before I set foot in Hollywood House. The mansion sat atop a hill overlooking the sleepy town of Hollywood. The exterior was a sight to behold, with its ornate architecture, towering turrets, and sprawling gardens. It was a place that seemed to belong to a different era, and the townsfolk whispered about its dark past. The house had stood empty for as long as anyone could remember, and its imposing presence cast a shadow over the town. My first night in Hollywood House was a surreal experience. As I walked through the echoing hallways with a single flickering candle, I couldn't help but wonder about the stories I'd heard. People claimed to have seen figures in the windows at night, heard unexplained footsteps in the empty corridors, and witnessed lights flicker and doors open and close on their own. These were the tales that had earned the mansion its haunted reputation. I settled into one of the spacious bedrooms on the second floor, the large canopy bed and heavy drapes making me feel like I'd stepped into a period drama. As I lay in bed, I tried to dismiss the unease I felt. The wind whistled through the old windows, and the house seemed to sigh with its own ancient history. That night, as I drifted off to sleep, I heard it, a faint, distant whisper. I dismissed it as a trick of the wind or my own overactive imagination. But the whisper persisted, growing louder and more distinct. It was as though a voice from the past was trying to communicate with me. I strained my ears, and the words became clearer. "Help me," the voice pleaded, soft and trembling. My heart raced as I sat up in bed, my breaths coming quick and shallow. The voice sounded desperate, like a soul in torment. I leaped out of bed and searched the room, but there was no one to be found. The windows were shut tight and the doors were locked. I had heard the voice, there was no doubt about it, but its source remained a mystery. In the following days, I tried to put the incident out of my mind, convincing myself that it had been a vivid dream. I was determined not to let such irrational thoughts take hold of me. I delved into my work, focusing on renovations to make the house livable. However, the feeling of being watched and the whispers persisted. It was as though the house itself was trying to communicate with me, to tell me something I couldn't yet comprehend. One evening, as I was exploring the dusty attic, I came across a trove of old letters and journals. They were written by the previous inhabitants of Hollywood House, the Eldridges, who had lived there in the late 19th century. The journals were filled with accounts of strange occurrences that mirrored my own experiences. One of them caught my eye. The house is not what it seems. It harbors a presence that defies explanation. We hear the whispers at night, voices from another world, and the shadows move with a purpose we cannot comprehend. The house is cursed, and it hungers for something we cannot fathom. The journals were filled with similar stories, of doors that opened on their own, of apparitions in the hallways, and of voices that pleaded for help. The Eldridges had lived in constant fear, and they eventually abandoned the house, leaving it to decay. I couldn't ignore the striking similarities between their experiences and my own. The house was not just haunted, it was cursed, as if an insatiable darkness clung to its very foundations. As I continued my research, I learned that the house had been built on the site of a tragic event, a fire that had claimed the lives of several townspeople. It was said that the souls of those who had perished in the fire were never at rest, and their restless spirits haunted the mansion. My skepticism wavered as the evidence piled up. The history of Hollywood House was filled with inexplicable events and unexplained phenomena. It was clear that the house held secrets that defied logic and reason. One night, as I sat in the library, the whispers grew louder. They seemed to surround me, as if the walls themselves were trying to communicate. I strained to listen, and the voice became distinct, a woman's voice filled with anguish. "Help me," she implored, her words resonating with sorrow. I followed the voice to the grand staircase, where a shadowy figure materialized before me. It was a woman, her eyes filled with despair. She was dressed in a gown from a bygone era, and her form flickered in and out of existence. "My name is Eleanor," she said, her voice trembling. "I died in the fire, and my spirit has been trapped here ever since. You are our only hope." Eleanor's story was one of tragedy. She had been a resident of Hollywood, a young woman with dreams and aspirations, until the fateful night of the fire. She had perished along with others, and their spirits had been bound to the house, unable to find peace. I couldn't turn my back on Eleanor's plea for help. I reached out to a local historian, Mr. Thompson, who had spent years researching the history of Hollywood House. He explained that the house was a focal point for paranormal activity, a place where the veil between the living and the dead was thin. With Mr. Thompson's guidance, we decided to conduct a ritual to free the trapped souls and cleanse the house of its dark history. We gathered in the living room, surrounded by candles and incense, and recited incantations passed down through generations. As we chanted, the atmosphere grew heavy, and the air seemed to vibrate with energy. The whispers in the walls intensified, as if the spirits were aware of our intentions. I felt a presence in the room, a gathering of souls seeking release. Suddenly, the room grew icy cold, and the shadowy figures of the trapped souls materialized before us. Eleanor, along with others, stood in a solemn assembly, their eyes filled with gratitude and longing. The atmosphere was charged with emotion as we completed the ritual. The spirits began to fade, their forms dissolving into the ether. Eleanor's voice, filled with relief, echoed through the room. "Thank you," she whispered, and then she was gone. The house fell silent, and the weight of its cursed history seemed to lift. The whispers were gone, and the oppressive atmosphere had dissipated. I had not only inherited a haunted house, but had played a part in setting its restless souls free. In the weeks that followed, Hollywood House no longer felt haunted. It was a place of serenity, with no whispers or unexplained phenomena. The history of the mansion had changed from one of darkness to one of redemption. As I continued my life in Hollywood, I couldn't help but reflect on the mysteries of the house. I had learned that sometimes the unexplainable defied the rational mind. The spirits that had haunted the house were not malevolent, but trapped souls seeking release from their torment. I had been a part of their liberation, and the experience had forever altered my perception of the supernatural. Hollywood House, once a place of fear and uncertainty, had become a sanctuary of peace and redemption. Its history no longer whispered of despair, but of the resilience of the human spirit and the power of compassion and understanding. And as I looked out at the town of Hollywood from the mansion's grand windows, I knew that the house had found its own peace, and so had I. And as I looked out at the town of Hollywood from the mansion's grand windows, I knew that the house had found its own peace, and so had I. Story 2. I had always imagined that the first year of marriage would be full of love, laughter, and adventure. My husband John and I were excited to begin this journey together. Little did we know that our adventure would take us to a place shrouded in mystery and darkness, a house with a history that had the townsfolk filled with fear. The house stood at the end of Willow Street, an imposing Victorian structure that loomed over the neighborhood. The moment we laid eyes on it, we fell in love. The high, arched windows, the ornate wooden details, and the sprawling garden in the back. Everything about the house was perfect. We were told that it had been empty for years, but no one seemed eager to share the reason. As we moved in, I couldn't help but feel a sense of trepidation. The house had an air of antiquity, with creaking floorboards and long, dark hallways. The previous owner had left behind old, dusty furniture that seemed to belong to another era. The entire place was a throwback to the 19th century. We spent our first few days unpacking and exploring our new home. The living room was adorned with a grand fireplace, and a beautiful chandelier hung from the ceiling. It was the perfect place for cozy evenings together. The kitchen, though outdated, had a charming feel, and I couldn't wait to cook our first meal there. The bedroom, with its heavy drapes and old-fashioned wardrobe, was both enchanting and slightly eerie. It wasn't long before strange occurrences began. At first, it was the soft whispers that seemed to emanate from the walls. John and I exchanged nervous glances as we tried to make out the words. The whispers were unintelligible, but they sounded like voices from another time. One evening, as we sat in the living room, we heard the whispers again. This time, I was certain that the voice said, "Help me." I shivered and looked at John, who had a concerned expression. He dismissed it as a draft or our imagination, but the unease lingered. As the weeks went by, the whispers grew more frequent. I decided to confide in our neighbor, Mrs. Davis, who had lived in the neighborhood for decades. She was known as the local historian and a keeper of town secrets. Mrs. Davis listened to my story with a knowing look. "That house, dear," she began. "It has a history and not a pleasant one. It was built by a wealthy family in the late 1800s, the Chattertons. They were reclusive, strange people, and the townsfolk had always whispered about their dark practices." She paused for effect. "The Chattertons dabbled in the occult, trying to communicate with the dead. They believed the house had a connection to the spirit world, and they performed rituals in the hopes of unlocking its secrets." My heart raced as I realized that the whispers we heard might be connected to the Chattertons' experiments. Mrs. Davis went on, "It said that they summoned a presence they couldn't control, and it cursed the house. After that, no one dared to live there, and the Chatterton family vanished without a trace." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The house we had so eagerly moved into had a dark and chilling history. But what could we do? We had just started our life together, and leaving wasn't an option. We decided to research the house's history and learn more about the Chatterton family. Our research led us to old newspaper clippings and journal entries from the late 1800s. The more we discovered, the more we realized the depth of the Chatterton family's obsession with the supernatural. They believed that the house was a portal to the afterlife and that they could communicate with the dead through seances and dark rituals. One journal in particular made my pulse rise. The whispers grow louder, and I fear we have awakened something dark. Shadows move through the house at night, and I've seen apparitions in the hallways. We must find a way to undo what we've done before it's too late. It was evident that the Chattertons had unleashed something beyond their control, and it had plagued the house ever since. As we delved deeper into the history, we couldn't ignore the increasing occurrences in the house. Doors would open and close on their own, and we heard footsteps in empty rooms. The whispers continued, and I couldn't help but feel that they were trying to tell us something. One night we awoke to the sound of a child crying. John rushed out of bed and followed the sound to the nursery. There he saw a faint, ghostly figure, a little girl in a white dress. She turned to him with tearful eyes, her voice trembling as she said, "Help me, please." As he reached out to touch her, she disappeared into thin air. John returned to our room, his face pale. "I saw her," he said, his voice shaking. "A little girl, just like the one from the old photographs we found in the attic. She was asking for help." We couldn't ignore the plea of the ghostly child any longer. We reached out to Mrs. Davis once more, hoping she could shed light on the mysterious girl. She listened intently and revealed that the Chattertons had a daughter, Emily, who had gone missing and was never found. It was believed that the entity they had summoned had taken her, and her spirit was trapped in the house. We realized that Emily's spirit was trying to communicate with us, asking for the help she never received in life. We couldn't turn our backs on her, and we decided to try and find a way to release her from the house's curse. Mrs. Davis suggested that we perform a ritual to free Emily's spirit. She explained that it would be a way to break the connection between the Chattertons' experiments and the trapped souls. We were hesitant but desperate to bring peace to the house. With Mrs. Davis's guidance, we gathered the necessary materials and prepared for the ritual. The air grew heavy as we lit candles, burned sage, and chanted incantations. The whispers in the walls grew louder and more frantic, as if the spirits were aware of our intentions. In the midst of the ritual, a chill filled the room and a shadowy figure appeared before us. It was Emily, her eyes filled with both fear and longing. She whispered, "Thank you," before slowly fading away, leaving behind an overwhelming sense of relief. As the ritual concluded, the house fell silent. The whispers were gone and the oppressive atmosphere lifted. It was as though the curse that had plagued the house for decades had finally been broken. We felt a sense of peace we had never experienced before. In the weeks that followed, the house no longer felt haunted. It was a place of warmth, and we could finally enjoy our marriage without the constant presence of restless spirits. Emily had found her release, and the darkness that had clung to the house had dissipated. Story 3. The day we moved into Sterling House was like any other. The sun cast long shadows on the lawn as we carried our boxes through the creaking front door. My husband David and I had always dreamed of owning an old Victorian house, and Sterling House was the embodiment of that dream. It was a stately 3-story structure with a wraparound porch, intricate woodwork, and a history that whispered through its weathered walls. Our 2 children, Emily and Daniel, were thrilled at the idea of living in such a grand house, though there was one peculiar aspect that gave them pause. The townsfolk had whispered about the house, calling it haunted and cursed. They claimed it was a place of restless spirits and unexplained events. But we dismissed these stories as mere superstition, eager to start our new life. The first night in Sterling House was quiet and uneventful. We gathered in the cozy, old-fashioned living room to celebrate our new beginning. The fireplace crackled with life, and Emily and Daniel played with their toys. The only thing that seemed odd was the faint odor of roses that lingered in the air, but we attributed it to some old potpourri left behind by the previous owners. That night, as we settled into our respective rooms, I couldn't help but marvel at the house's character. The rooms were spacious, and the moonlight filtered through the lace curtains, casting intricate patterns on the hardwood floors. I fell asleep to the soothing sound of the wind rustling through the leaves outside. But then, in the dead of night, I was jolted awake by a soft, distant whisper. It was so faint that I couldn't make out the words. I lay in bed, straining my ears, but the voice disappeared as quickly as it had come. I shook off the cold feeling, blaming it on my imagination running wild. Over the next few weeks, strange things began to happen. Emily started having vivid nightmares, waking up in tears, speaking of a dark figure at the foot of her bed. Daniel claimed he saw his toys move on their own and heard whispers in the hallways. I too experienced the whispered voices at odd hours, and the scent of roses became more pronounced. David, ever the skeptic, brushed off our concerns, attributing it to stress and our overactive imaginations. He urged us to embrace the house's charm and history, rather than fear its supposed hauntings. One day, while I was cleaning out the attic, I came across a stack of old, dusty journals. They were filled with the handwritten thoughts and experiences of previous residents. The entries were a mix of mundane daily life and accounts of strange occurrences that mirrored our own. One sentence from the year 1923 stood out. "The whispers persist, and I can't bear to sleep in the master bedroom anymore. The scent of roses lingers, and I often feel a cold presence by my side. I know not what haunts this house, but I am certain it is not of this world." The journal was filled with similar stories, and it sent a cold breeze down my back. I shared my discovery with David, who, despite his skepticism, couldn't deny the scary connection between our experiences and those of the previous residents. As our unease grew, we decided to investigate the house's history. We discovered that a family named the Sterlings had lived in the house for generations until it was sold to the family we had purchased it from. The Sterlings had been prominent in the town, known for their wealth and power. Rumor had it that the family had a dark side, dabbling in the occult and dark practices. Determined to put an end to the unsettling occurrences, we decided to contact a local historian to learn more about the Sterling family's past. The historian, Mrs. Anderson, was a frail elderly woman with a wealth of knowledge about the town's history. She invited us to her home to share her findings. Mrs. Anderson's living room was filled with ancient books and dusty tomes. She began to recount the history of the Sterlings, explaining that they had been obsessed with the occult and the afterlife. They were rumored to have performed dark rituals within the house, and it was said that they had communed with the dead. The Sterlings were searching for something beyond the realm of the living, Mrs. Anderson said. They believed that the house held a gateway to another world, and their experiments were their attempt to bridge the gap between life and death. As she spoke, I couldn't help but wonder if the strange occurrences we'd experienced were somehow linked to the Sterling family's obsession with the supernatural. Mrs. Anderson offered to help us cleanse the house and rid it of any lingering negative energy. She explained that we needed to perform a ritual that would break the connection between our world and the other side. That night we gathered in the living room, the hearth crackling with a warm fire. Mrs. Anderson led the ritual, guiding us through each step. We lit candles, burned sage, and recited incantations to banish any lingering spirits. As we chanted, the air grew heavy and the scent of roses became overpowering. A soft wind rustled through the curtains. Suddenly, the temperature in the room dropped and a shadowy figure materialized before us. It was a woman, her eyes hollow and sorrowful. She seemed to be from another time, dressed in a gown reminiscent of the early 1900s. Her presence made my blood freeze. The figure spoke in a soft, mournful voice. "You have awakened me from my slumber. I am Isabella Sterling, and I have been trapped in this house for eternity. The experiments of my family tethered me to this realm, and I have longed for release." Tears welled up in her eyes as she told us her story. Isabella explained that she had been an innocent victim of her family's dark pursuits. They had used her as a vessel to communicate with the dead, and her spirit had been bound to the house ever since. We felt a deep sympathy for Isabella, trapped in a liminal state between life and death. Mrs. Anderson continued the ritual, beseeching Isabella to find peace and move on to the afterlife. Isabella's form began to waver, and her voice faded as she gradually disappeared into the ether. The room grew still and the scent of roses lifted. It was as though the weight of centuries had been lifted from Sterling House. We completed the ritual, ensuring that Isabella's spirit had found the release it had longed for. In the days that followed, the house felt different. The air was lighter, and the unsettling occurrences ceased. Emily and Daniel's nightmares subsided, and the whispers that had haunted us for weeks disappeared. It was as if the house had been cleansed of its dark past. Sterling House, once a place of fear and uncertainty, had become a warm and welcoming home. Isabella's presence no longer lingered, and the history that had whispered through its walls was now a distant echo. We had finally found peace in our new home. As the years passed, we cherished our time in Sterling House. It had become a place of happiness, where our family had grown. In the heart of summer, Mark set out on a cross-country journey to visit his family. The open road stretched before him, inviting him to embark on an adventure filled with excitement and the promise of reunions with loved ones. Armed with a map, a trusty old car, and a sense of adventure, he headed out, leaving behind the bustling city for the wide expanse of the countryside. As Mark drove through picturesque landscapes and quiet towns, he marveled at the diversity of the country. The journey was marked by changing scenery, from lush forests to rolling hills and dusty highways. Along the way, he exchanged pleasantries with friendly strangers, visited quaint diners, and admired roadside attractions. The trip was proving to be everything he had hoped for. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Mark found himself in a remote stretch of the highway, far from any signs of civilization. The desolation of the area was almost sinister, with miles of empty road surrounded by an expansive wilderness. As he drove, he noticed that his fuel gauge was approaching empty, and the nearest gas station was still miles away. Growing increasingly anxious, Mark kept an eye on the fuel gauge, hoping that he could reach the gas station in time. But as the needle inched closer to E, a sense of unease settled in. He knew he was in a remote area, and the idea of running out of gas in the middle of nowhere was unsettling. The car's engine sputtered, and Mark watched in dread as the fuel gauge finally hit E. The engine died, and he coasted to a stop on the side of the highway. Panic surged through him as he realized the predicament he was in, stranded in a desolate place with no one in sight. Mark's initial reaction was to call for help, but to his dismay, he discovered that his cell phone had no signal in the remote location. He felt a sense of isolation and vulnerability, and his mind raced as he tried to figure out what to do next. Just as he was considering starting the long walk to the gas station, a vehicle approached from behind. A pickup truck pulled up, and Mark watched with a mixture of relief and caution as a burly man in his 40s stepped out. The man wore a worn flannel shirt, and his face was obscured by a scruffy beard. He had a gruff appearance, and Mark couldn't quite read his intentions. "Car trouble?" the man asked, his voice a gravelly baritone. Mark nodded, trying to sound as composed as possible. "Yeah, I ran out of gas. I was just about to start walking to the gas station." The man's response was a slow, almost menacing smile that made Mark freeze. "No need for that, friend. I can help you out." Reluctantly, Mark accepted the man's offer of assistance. The stranger retrieved a gas can from his truck and began pouring the fuel into Mark's tank. As he worked, he engaged Mark in conversation, asking about his journey and his destination. Mark was polite but guarded, sensing something unsettling about the man. There was an air of intensity and a strange gleam in the stranger's eyes that made him uncomfortable. Still, he couldn't afford to turn down the help, especially in such a remote area. As the man finished refueling the car, Mark tried to offer him some money as a token of appreciation. The stranger waved it away with a dismissive gesture. "No need for that. I'm just glad I could help out a fellow traveler." Mark felt a growing sense of unease as the man returned to his truck. He thanked the stranger and got back into his car, eager to leave the desolate stretch of highway behind. However, as he pulled away, he noticed the stranger getting into his truck as well, and an uncomfortable feeling gnawed at his gut. Mark couldn't shake the sensation that he was being followed. He tried to rationalize it, telling himself that the man might be going in the same direction, but the unease persisted. The stranger's presence and the strange conversation they had shared haunted him as he drove on. Miles passed, and the highway seemed to stretch on forever. The stranger remained a constant presence in Mark's rearview mirror. Never too close, but never too far either. The paranoia grew, and he couldn't escape the nagging feeling that something was horribly wrong. To put his mind at ease, Mark decided to exit the highway at the next opportunity, hoping to lose the stranger on the back roads. He made a quick turn, leaving the main road behind, and tried to find a place to lay low. As he navigated the winding roads, he glanced in his rearview mirror, relieved to see that the stranger was nowhere in sight. Mark drove for several more miles, feeling a renewed sense of freedom. It seemed that he had successfully eluded his unwanted companion. He decided to stop at a nearby rest area to gather his thoughts and plan his next move. But just as he pulled into the empty rest area and parked his car, a sense of dread washed over him. The stranger's pickup truck had pulled in behind him, and the man emerged from the vehicle, wearing the same scary smile as before. Mark's heart raced as he realized the stranger had been following him all along. He considered his options, but the isolation of the rest area left him with few choices. The stranger approached his car, and Mark locked the doors, his hand trembling as he reached for his cell phone, still hoping for a signal. The stranger tapped on the window, his grin growing wider and more unsettling. "You tried to lose me back there, didn't you? That's not very nice." Fear coursed through Mark's veins, and he had no doubt that the stranger's intentions were far from benign. Desperation gripped him, and he reached for the car's ignition, preparing to make a hasty escape. But before he could react, the stranger produced a knife from his pocket, its blade glinting in the dim light. He began to slash at the tires of Mark's car, rendering it immobile. Panic and terror consumed Mark as he realized the dire situation he was in. With his car incapacitated, Mark had no choice but to open the window and face the menacing stranger. The man's smile had transformed into a sadistic grin, and he leaned in closer, the glint of the knife blade dancing in his eyes. "You shouldn't have tried to run, friend," the stranger whispered, his voice dripping with malice. Just as Mark feared the worst, the rest area's silence was shattered by the distant wail of sirens. The approaching police cars' flashing lights painted the scene with a sense of hope. The stranger, realizing the imminent danger, retreated and fled to his pickup truck. The police car skidded to a stop, and officers apprehended the stranger, who struggled violently but was eventually subdued. Mark's heart pounded with a mixture of relief and gratitude. The police explained that the man was a known criminal with a history of violence and assault. They had been tracking him for some time, and Mark's call for help had led them to the rest area just in the nick of time. Story 2. David and Sarah, a married couple, set out on a romantic getaway to celebrate their anniversary. They decided to explore the less traveled backroads of the countryside, hoping to discover hidden gems and make memories together. The open road stretched before them, and they were filled with anticipation and excitement. The journey was punctuated by laughter, heartfelt conversations, and moments of pure happiness. They cherished the serenity of the open road, taking turns behind the wheel, and stopping at quaint roadside diners and antique shops. One evening they found themselves on a winding, desolate road, far from the bustling towns they had grown accustomed to. The remoteness of the area was almost creepy, with dense forests on either side of the road and no other vehicles in sight. As the day waned and the sun dipped below the horizon, David noticed that their fuel gauge was nearing empty. Sarah glanced at the gauge and said, "We should look for a gas station soon. The nearest town should have one." With growing concern, they continued driving, their eyes scanning the forested landscape for any signs of civilization. But as the fuel gauge inched closer to E, a sense of unease began to settle in. David muttered, "We're running low on gas. I hope we find a station soon." Just when their anxiety was reaching its peak, they spotted a small road sign that pointed to a nearby gas station. Their relief was palpable as they followed the signs to the station, anticipating a chance to refuel and continue their journey. However, when they reached the gas station, their optimism turned to dismay. It was dark and abandoned, a relic from a bygone era. The pumps were old and rusted, with no sign of life around. It became clear that the station had been out of operation for years. With a heavy heart, David turned to Sarah and said, "It looks like we'll have to find another station. Let's hope there's one not too far away." As they continued driving down the winding road, the forest grew denser and the sense of isolation more pronounced. Sarah, peering at the map, suggested that there was another gas station a few miles ahead. But as they drove on, there was still no sign of civilization, and their fuel gauge inched perilously close to empty. The anxiety that had been simmering for some time began to boil over. David felt a growing sense of dread, but he didn't want to burden Sarah with his fear. Instead, he kept his eyes on the road, searching for any sign of hope. Just when they were beginning to lose hope, they spotted a small, secluded house nestled in the woods. A dim light glowed in one of the windows, offering a faint glimmer of hope. David decided to stop and ask for directions or help, thinking that maybe the residents would have a gas can or some information about the nearest station. As they approached the house, the atmosphere grew increasingly strange. The dense woods seemed to encroach upon the road, and the night was eerily silent. The sense of isolation was overwhelming, and it felt as if they were the only people for miles around. David parked the car in front of the house, and they hesitantly approached the front door. As they reached the porch, they could hear faint, muffled voices from inside, and the sound of clinking utensils and dishes. Sarah whispered, "It seems like a family dinner. Let's knock and ask for help." David agreed, and he raised his hand to knock on the door. But before he could do so, the door swung open with a creak. revealing a tall, imposing man in his 50s. He had a scruffy beard and intense, unblinking eyes that seemed to pierce through David and Sarah. "Can I help you?" the man asked, his voice steady but devoid of warmth. David stammered, "We're out of gas and we were wondering if you could point us to the nearest gas station. We saw your lights on and thought maybe you could help." The man's smile was strained and his gaze never left them. "I'm sorry, but we're quite far from the nearest gas station. You're welcome to come inside and wait for morning, but we can't offer any gas." As they entered the house, the weird atmosphere only intensified. The interior was strange, and the dining room was filled with people, their faces blank and devoid of emotion. It was as if the entire family had been frozen in time, trapped in a strange tableau. The man introduced David and Sarah to his family, but there was something deeply unsettling about the encounter. The family members barely acknowledged their presence, and their dinner table was laid out with strange, unappetizing dishes. The air was heavy with silence, punctuated only by the sound of utensils scraping against plates. As David and Sarah sat at the table, the man's demeanor grew more unnerving. He continued to stare at them, his gaze unyielding. "You must be hungry after your journey. Please help yourselves to dinner." David and Sarah glanced at the peculiar dishes before them, unable to hide their discomfort. The food appeared to be a mix of unidentifiable ingredients, and an odd odor permeated the room. They politely declined the offer, but the man insisted, his insistence growing increasingly unsettling. Hours passed, and the couple found themselves trapped in a strange, unsettling limbo. The family remained unresponsive, their strange tableau unchanged. David and Sarah felt like unwelcome guests, and the fear that had been simmering beneath the surface grew more pronounced. Finally, as the clock approached midnight, the man rose from the table and approached David and Sarah, his eyes fixed on them with an unsettling intensity. "You can't leave. You must stay the night." Sarah's heart raced as she asked, "Why can't we leave?" "We just need to find a gas station." The man's response was chilling. "You can't leave because you've seen too much. You know our secret, and we can't allow you to leave." In an instant, the situation escalated from strange to horrifying. The man's demeanor turned menacing, and his family members rose from the table, their blank faces now contorted with malevolence. David and Sarah realized that they were in grave danger. With adrenaline surging through their veins, they made a desperate attempt to escape. They bolted for the front door, but the man and his family pursued them with a chilling determination. As they raced back to their car, the night seemed to close in on them, the forest swallowing them whole. The pursuit was relentless, and the man's sinister laughter echoed through the woods. Desperation drove David and Sarah to their limits as they tried to outrun their pursuers. They sprinted through the thick woods, their breaths ragged and their hearts pounding. But the family's knowledge of the terrain gave them an advantage, and the pursuit showed no signs of relenting. Just when it seemed that David and Sarah were doomed, they stumbled upon a small cabin in the woods. The door was unlocked and they burst inside, barricading themselves in. The family members arrived moments later, their hands pounding on the door with a terrifying, relentless rhythm. David and Sarah huddled together, their hearts racing as they realized the direness of their situation. The cabin's interior was shrouded in darkness, and they knew that they had no means of escape. The scary sounds of the family members outside, their footsteps and taunts, filled the cabin with dread. As the night wore on, the couple's hope began to fade. The sinister family showed no signs of giving up, and the relentless pursuit had become a nightmare that refused to end. The darkness was their only ally, but it couldn't shield them from the malevolent presence lurking just outside the cabin. In the darkness, David and Sarah clung to each other, their fear and desperation consuming them. The horrifying realization that they were trapped in a remote cabin with no hope of escape, at the mercy of a sinister family, was a nightmare come to life. Story 3. In the heart of summer, 4 friends, Lisa, Jake, Sarah, and Mike, decided to embark on a road trip that would take them through the picturesque landscapes of the American Southwest. With a packed car, they set out on a journey filled with laughter, adventure, and the promise of unforgettable memories. Their chosen route would lead them through desolate stretches of highway that wound through vast, arid deserts, isolated and remote. As they drove, the scenery transformed from bustling cities to barren wilderness, and the open road seemed to stretch on forever. Lisa, the driver, navigated with precision as Jake, her partner, manned the stereo. Their laughter filled the car, and they sang along to their favorite tunes, their spirits high as they embraced the freedom of the open road. Sarah and Mike in the back seat shared jokes and snacks, their faces illuminated by the ever-present glow of their smartphones. Hours passed, and the group marveled at the stunning vistas that unfolded before them. The landscape was simultaneously awe-inspiring and desolate, a stark reminder of the vastness of nature. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, the realization dawned that they were venturing deeper into the isolated desert, with no signs of civilization in sight. "We should probably find a gas station soon," Lisa remarked, her eyes scanning the barren landscape. Jake consulted the map and his smartphone, trying to determine the nearest gas station. There should be one a bit further ahead, but it's hard to tell exactly how far. With growing concern, they continued driving, hoping to reach the elusive gas station before their fuel gauge reached empty. But the hours passed, and their situation grew more precarious. The landscape became increasingly desolate, with no signs of life or infrastructure. The fuel gauge continued its relentless descent, and anxiety filled the car. Jake's phone lost signal, leaving them without GPS or a means to contact anyone for help. The group exchanged worried glances, realizing they were in a dire predicament. "It's been hours since we saw a gas station," Lisa said, her voice tinged with panic. Mike, trying to stay positive, tried to reassure the group. "There's got to be something up ahead, we'll make it." As the last dregs of fuel were siphoned from the tank, the engine sputtered and died. The car coasted to a halt on the side of the highway, surrounded by an endless expanse of desert under the moonlight. Desperation hung heavy in the air as they stepped out of the car and looked around. The silence was dark, broken only by the howling of the wind through the barren landscape. "We can't stay out here," Sarah said, her voice trembling. Mike's face was grim as he surveyed the empty highway. "We'll have to start walking and look for help. Maybe we'll find a gas station or a passing vehicle." With no other option, they set off on foot, clutching their flashlights and whatever supplies they had in the car. The desert night was unforgiving, the temperature dropping rapidly, and the haunting emptiness of the landscape added to their growing fear. Hours turned into a seemingly endless trek, and their energy waned. Sarah and Lisa shivered in the cold desert air, their feet aching from the miles they'd walked. Their hope began to fade, replaced by a gnawing dread that they might never find help in this desolation. Suddenly, Mike spotted a distant glow on the horizon. "Look, there's a light. It could be a gas station or a building. Let's go." Renewed with hope, they quickened their pace, heading toward the distant light. But as they approached, they realized it was not a gas station, but a solitary, dilapidated building that seemed abandoned for years. The flickering neon sign that once declared Oasis Diner hung precariously, its letters missing or askew. Reluctantly, they entered the diner, their flashlights revealing a scene frozen in time. Dust-covered tables and chairs, shattered glass, and tattered menus were strewn about the interior. It was a haunting sight that left them with a sense of foreboding. Mike called out, but there was no response. The place seemed deserted, and its silence was scary. With no other options, they decided to search for any supplies that might help them get back on the road. As they explored the diner, they discovered an old cash register, empty except for a few decaying dollar bills. In the kitchen, they found a pantry with canned goods and bottled water, which would sustain them for a short while. The group debated whether to spend the night in the abandoned diner or continue their journey on foot. The decision was fraught with uncertainty, but the chilling isolation of the desert night outside made the choice clear. They decided to stay and rest before resuming their quest for help at first light. In the diner's back room, they huddled together, trying to find comfort and warmth. They shared stories and jokes to lighten the mood, but the strange surroundings and their dire situation hung heavily over them. Sleep proved elusive, as the hours crept by in torturous silence. The sense of isolation weighed on them, and their growing anxiety made each creak of the abandoned building seem like an impending threat. Just as they were beginning to doze off, a haunting sound echoed through the diner, a sound that sent a cold feeling down their backs. It was a faint, creepy melody, like an old music box playing a twisted lullaby. The group's eyes met, their faces pale with fear. "Did you hear that?" Jake whispered, his voice trembling. Sarah nodded, her eyes wide with terror. "It's coming from the kitchen." Mike, with a flashlight in hand, ventured into the dark kitchen. The others followed, their hearts pounding as the haunting melody grew louder. As they entered the kitchen, they discovered the source of the sound. An old music box on the counter, its cracked lid slightly ajar. The music box played its haunting tune with a life of its own, its winding key untouched. The melody had an ethereal quality, as if it were beckoning them to some dark, mysterious place. Terrified and unable to comprehend the phenomenon, they watched as the lid of the music box slowly closed, its music fading into silence. Goosebumps covered their skin, and a sense of dread weighed heavily on their hearts. Before they could react, a figure emerged from the shadows of the kitchen, its presence sending shockwaves of fear through their bodies. It was a haggard, emaciated man, dressed in rags, his eyes hollow and empty. The man's voice croaked as he whispered, "You should have left when you had the chance." The group retreated in terror, their hearts racing as they realized they were not alone in the abandoned diner. The man's ghastly appearance and his cryptic words left them paralyzed with fear. Their instincts kicked in and they ran for the exit, fleeing the diner in a panic. The night had grown colder and the desert was an even more inhospitable place than they had thought. They were filled with a deep sense of dread, unsure of what horrors awaited them in the desolate darkness. As they ventured further into the desert, the echoes of the haunting melody and the spectral presence of the man lingered in their minds, haunting their every step. The night was unrelenting, and their fear grew with each passing moment. Their desperate journey seemed endless, and they were tormented by the belief that they were being pursued by an unseen force. The desert landscape stretched out before them, an unforgiving expanse that offered no solace. Just as exhaustion threatened to overcome them, they spotted the distant glow of headlights. A vehicle was approaching, and they waved their arms frantically, their voices hoarse as they cried for help. The vehicle slowed to a stop and a lone figure stepped out. It was a truck driver, a grizzled man with a weathered face who listened to their story with a mixture of concern and skepticism. "We ran out of gas and ended up in an abandoned diner," Lisa explained, her voice shaking. "We heard a music box playing by itself, and there was a man there who said we should have left." The truck driver's expression darkened and he glanced toward the horizon. "You're lucky I found you. That abandoned diner has a dark history. They say it's haunted by the souls of those who got lost in the desert and never found their way out." With a sense of urgency, the truck driver offered to take them to the nearest town, where they could get the help they needed. As they piled into the truck, their relief was palpable, and they couldn't escape the feeling that they had narrowly escaped a horrific fate. On the rugged cliffs of Ravens Point, overlooking the tempestuous sea, stood an ancient lighthouse that bore the scars of time. Locals whispered of its haunted history, a tale of lost souls and a beacon that called out across the abyss. Intrigued by the eerie rumors, I embarked on a journey to unravel the mysteries that shrouded the desolate structure. As I approached Ravens Point, the wind carried with it the mournful cries of seagulls and the distant roar of crashing waves. The lighthouse loomed on the cliff's edge, its weather-beaten exterior bearing witness to decades of maritime tumult. A lone beam of light swept across the darkening horizon, a spectral sentinel that seemed to beckon those daring enough to uncover the secrets within. The entrance creaked open with a foreboding groan as I stepped into the lighthouse. The air was thick with the scent of salt and decay, and the walls echoed with the sound of my footsteps on the spiraling staircase that ascended to the beacon above. Flickering candlelight cast distorted shadows on the walls, and the haunting melody of the wind seeped through the cracks in the structure. As I climbed higher, the atmosphere grew increasingly oppressive. The air itself seemed to thicken, and the temperature dropped as if the lighthouse retained the cold touch of the souls it had witnessed. The steps beneath my feet felt worn and hollow, echoing the weight of forgotten footsteps that had ascended the staircase before. Upon reaching the beacon room, I discovered a vast, circular chamber with panoramic windows that offered a view of the tumultuous sea below. The beam of light swept across the darkness, cutting through the night like a spectral blade. An old ship's wheel stood at the center, an artifact of a bygone era when the lighthouse was manned by keepers who braved the elements to guide sailors to safety. The room bore the scars of abandonment, with dusty charts and faded nautical instruments scattered about. The wind whistled through the cracks in the windows, producing an eerie, melodic hum that seemed to echo the lighthouse's lament. It was as if the very structure mourned the absence of the keepers who had once tended to its beacon. As I examined the artifacts, a sudden gust of wind extinguished the candles, plunging the room into darkness. The beam of light outside continued its ceaseless rotation, casting intermittent flashes that revealed glimpses of a figure standing at the far end of the room, a shadowy silhouette that seemed to materialize from the abyss. A chill ran down my spine as the figure approached, its movements deliberate yet ethereal. The air crackled with an unseen energy, and the temperature plummeted. The room became a battleground between light and shadow, and the wind carried with it a mournful whisper that seemed to emanate from the very walls. The figure, now discernible in the intermittent flashes of light, bore the attire of a lighthouse keeper from a bygone era, a tattered uniform and a weathered hat that obscured its features. Hollow eyes stared into the abyss, and a ghostly hand reached out, beckoning me to follow. Driven by a morbid curiosity, I stepped into the darkness with the figure as my guide. The beam of light outside cast a fractured illumination on the spiral staircase, revealing glimpses of spectral apparitions that lingered in the shadows. It was as if the lighthouse itself had become a realm between worlds, a purgatory for lost souls bound by a maritime tragedy. Descending deeper into the lighthouse, the whispers of the sea grew louder, weaving a haunting symphony with the echoes of bygone footsteps and the lament of the wind. The air vibrated with a spectral resonance, and the boundary between the living and the dead blurred into a disorienting dance of shadows. In the bowels of the lighthouse, I discovered a forgotten chamber, the keeper's quarters adorned with faded photographs and maritime memorabilia. The figure, now a melancholic specter, stood beside a decaying cot, its gaze fixed upon an old journal that lay open on a weathered desk. As I approached, the journal revealed the tragic tale of the lighthouse keeper, a man named Elias Grayson who had tended to Ravens Point for decades. The entries chronicled the keeper's descent into madness, his isolation, and his obsession with a ghostly siren song that echoed across the sea. Elias's words spoke of an otherworldly allure that had ensnared him, a haunting melody that seemed to emanate from the depths of the ocean. The spectral figure beside me reached out, and as its ghostly fingers traced the words in the journal, the very air seemed to vibrate with the lament of the lighthouse keeper. In a moment of revelation, the figure turned toward me, its hollow eyes filled with an eternal sorrow. It spoke, its voice a whisper on the wind, revealing the tragic fate of Elias Grayson, a man consumed by the haunting song of a siren that lured him to the treacherous cliffs below. As the spectral figure recounted Elias's demise, the chamber itself seemed to morph into a spectral tableau. The wind howled with a mournful intensity, and the very walls bore witness to the lighthouse keeper's tragic descent into the abyss. The air thickened with an otherworldly energy, and the boundaries between the living and the dead blurred into a disorienting dance of shadows. In a final, harrowing revelation, the figure gestured toward the panoramic window. The beam of light outside cast a fractured illumination on the churning sea below, revealing ghostly apparitions that ascended from the depths, a legion of lost souls trapped in the siren song, forever bound to the lighthouse's lament. And then, with a spectral wail that echoed through the abyss, the figure and the ghostly apparitions vanished into the shadows. The room itself seemed to exhale, the air heavy with the weight of a maritime tragedy that refused to be forgotten. As I stood alone in the now silent chamber, the wind carried with it the mournful cries of the lost souls that lingered within the lighthouse's haunted embrace. The beam of light outside continued its ceaseless rotation, casting an ephemeral glow on the desolate sea below, a sea that held the secrets of a spectral song that would forever haunt Ravens Point. Story 2. In the small town of Ravenswood, nestled between the dense woods and rolling hills, there existed a dilapidated mansion that bore the weight of a dark history. Locals spoke of the house in hushed tones, avoiding the overgrown path that led to its imposing entrance. Rumors of a sinister presence, of spectral apparitions that wandered its desolate halls, kept even the bravest townsfolk at bay. I, however, was not one to succumb to local superstitions. Fueled by a journalist's curiosity and a thirst for unraveling the unknown, I decided to venture into the heart of Ravenswood and investigate the haunted mansion. The air was thick with an unspoken tension as I approached the creaking iron gates that guarded the path to the foreboding structure. The mansion loomed in the distance, its facade obscured by the twisted branches of gnarled trees. The overcast sky cast a pallor over the desolate landscape, intensifying the eerie atmosphere that clung to the air. As I approached the entrance, the wind whispered through the decaying leaves, as if warning me of the darkness that awaited within. The mansion's doors groaned in protest as I pushed them open, revealing a grand foyer that had long lost its former splendor. Dust-covered furniture lay shrouded in white sheets, and the air carried the musty scent of neglect. A cold draft swept through the corridor, carrying with it a mournful sigh that seemed to echo through the empty halls. My footsteps echoed as I explored the mansion's labyrinthine corridors. Each room bore the scars of time, with faded wallpaper peeling away to reveal the decaying walls beneath. Portraits of somber-faced individuals stared down at me from their gilded frames, their eyes seeming to follow my every move. It was as if the very walls themselves held memories that refused to fade. As I delved deeper into the mansion, a subtle unease settled in the pit of my stomach. Shadows danced on the walls, shifting and contorting as if animated by unseen forces. The temperature dropped, and an otherworldly hush enveloped the air, creating an almost tangible sense of foreboding. In the dark light, I stumbled upon a door at the end of a long corridor, seemingly untouched by time. The wood, though aged, retained a certain luster that set it apart from the rest of the mansion's disrepair. The handle felt cool to the touch as I turned it, revealing a room bathed in an ethereal glow. The room was adorned with ancient tapestries and archaic symbols etched into the walls. A single flickering candle illuminated a peculiar object at the center, a mirror that seemed to emanate an otherworldly aura. The reflection in the mirror, however, was not my own. As I gazed into the reflective surface, the room seemed to warp and contort. The air thickened with an unseen energy and the temperature plummeted. The mirror revealed not the grandeur of the room, but a desolate expanse, a realm of shadows and twisted reality. It was as if the mirror was a portal to another dimension, a place where the veil between the living and the dead was thin. A figure materialized in the distorted reflection, a specter with hollow eyes that bore into mine. Its gaunt features twisted in anguish, and an ethereal wail filled the room. The very fabric of reality seemed to unravel as the figure reached out from the mirror, its ghostly fingers stretching toward me. I stumbled back in terror, but an invisible force held me in place. The room pulsated with an otherworldly energy as the specter emerged from the mirror, its form transitioning from the spectral realm into the corporeal world. The air crackled with an unholy force, and the temperature dropped to an icy chill. The specter, now free from the confines of the mirror, moved with a haunting grace. Its movements were deliberate, as if driven by a dark intent. The room seemed to darken in its presence, the shadows coalescing around the figure like loyal minions. I tried to flee, my footsteps echoing through the desolate mansion, but the specter pursued with an inexorable determination. The air itself seemed to resist my escape, as if the very mansion conspired with the spectral entity to keep me captive within its walls. As I reached the grand foyer, the mansion itself seemed to shift. The walls groaned and the shadows reached out with ghostly fingers. The specter closed in, its hollow gaze fixed upon me. I could feel its icy breath on the back of my neck, and a whispered lamentation echoed in the air. In a final act of desperation, I burst through the mansion doors and stumbled into the moonlit night. The air outside was thick with an oppressive energy, and the wind carried with it the mournful wails of the specter that lingered within. The mansion loomed behind me, its windows glowing with an otherworldly light, as if the very soul of the structure had been tainted by the sinister force that now walked its desolate halls. I fled through the twisted path, the forest seemingly alive with spectral echoes. The very trees whispered in tandem with the haunting footsteps that pursued me. The specter, now a looming presence at the edge of my vision, cast a shadow that stretched far beyond its physical form. In a final moment of dread, I realized that escape was impossible. The specter overtook me with a spectral embrace, its form merging with mine. Darkness enveloped my senses, and a chorus of anguished whispers filled my mind. I became one with the specter, a prisoner in the mansion's eternal grasp. The night air echoed with the mournful wails of the haunted entity, now free to roam the desolate corridors with a new, unwilling companion. The mansion, now cloaked in an otherworldly glow, seemed to revel in its newfound darkness. The wind carried with it the sorrowful echoes of the trapped souls that lingered within, and the very air vibrated with a spectral lamentation. In that moment of horrific union, I became a part of the haunted history of Ravenswood Mansion, a tale whispered in the shadows, a spectral presence forever bound to the dark force that dwelled within its walls. Story 3. In the heart of the Appalachian Mountains, nestled between ancient trees and winding trails, there lay a village forgotten by time. Locals spoke in hushed whispers about the mysterious hamlet, its existence known only to a select few who dared to venture into the depths of the dense forest. Rumors of an otherworldly presence and unsettling occurrences clung to the village like a shroud, but no one could pinpoint its exact location. Intrigued by the tales that had passed through generations, I embarked on a journey to unravel the mysteries of the vanishing village. Armed with little more than a backpack and a sense of trepidation, I delved into the heart of the dense forest. The air was thick with an unspoken tension, and the shadows of the towering trees seemed to whisper secrets that eluded my understanding. As I ventured deeper into the woods, the ambient sounds of nature faded into an oppressive silence. The only company I had was the rhythmic crunch of leaves beneath my boots and the occasional rustle of unseen creatures in the underbrush. A thick fog clung to the air, shrouding the forest in an eerie stillness. Hours passed, and just as doubt began to creep into my mind, I stumbled upon a clearing bathed in an otherworldly light. In the center stood the village, a collection of weathered cottages and cobblestone paths that seemed to materialize out of the mist. It was as if the village had been plucked from the pages of a forgotten fairy tale, frozen in time and untouched by the passage of centuries. The air in the village carried a sense of sadness, and the creaking of the old windmill added to the haunting ambience. The cobblestone streets were empty, and the windows of the cottages stared back at me like vacant eyes. It was a place lost to time, a relic of a bygone era. As I explored the village, a disconcerting feeling settled in the pit of my stomach. The silence was deafening, broken only by the distant hum of the wind. It was as if the village itself held its breath, waiting for something that lingered just beyond the edge of perception. The cottages, though seemingly abandoned, bore signs of recent activity. Tables were set for meals, and clothes hung on washing lines as if the inhabitants had vanished mid-task. Unease gripped me as I realized the village was not abandoned but suspended in a perpetual state of anticipation. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch with a life of their own. In the light, I noticed a figure in the distance, a silhouette that stood motionless at the edge of the village square. As I approached, the figure revealed itself to be an elderly man, his eyes glazed with a haunted gaze. He spoke in hushed tones, revealing the tale of the village's curse. Generations ago, the villagers had made a pact with an ancient entity, trading their mortality for prosperity. In return, the entity demanded a sacrifice, a soul to be claimed each year as the price for the village's continued existence. The man's voice trembled as he explained how the village had become trapped in a nightmarish loop, forever reliving the same events leading up to the annual sacrifice. Each year, a chosen villager would vanish without a trace, and the rest would continue their lives as if nothing had happened. The memories of the taken were erased, and the village would reset, ready to repeat the cycle once more. As he spoke, the air grew colder, and the shadows around us seemed to writhe with an unnatural energy. The man urged me to leave, to escape the clutches of the village before the cycle reset once more. But a morbid curiosity held me in place, as if an unseen force compelled me to witness the unfolding tragedy. The night wore on, and a sense of impending dread hung in the air. The villagers moved through the motions of their lives, oblivious to the looming darkness that threatened to consume them. As the hour approached midnight, the atmosphere in the village became increasingly tense, a palpable energy that crackled with darkness. In the village square, a group of villagers assembled in somber silence. They moved with a resigned determination, their faces etched with a sorrow that transcended the passage of time. At the center of the gathering stood a hooded figure, the harbinger of the annual sacrifice. As the clock struck midnight, a haunting melody echoed through the village, emanating from an unseen source. The air itself seemed to vibrate with the spectral tune, as if the very fabric of reality resonated with the impending ritual. The hooded figure stepped forward, and the villagers parted to reveal a trapdoor hidden beneath the cobblestones. With a heavy heart, I watched as the trapdoor opened, revealing a yawning abyss below. The hooded figure descended into the darkness, disappearing from sight. The villagers, their expressions vacant, closed the trapdoor and returned to their daily lives. The memory of the sacrifice erased from their minds. A chilling realization gripped me. The sacrifice was not just a physical disappearance, but a metaphysical erasure of existence. The soul of the sacrificed villager was not only taken from the village, but erased from the collective memory of those who remained. As the night wore on, the cycle of the village's curse reset once more. The hooded figure reappeared in the square. The trapdoor opened, and the villagers, oblivious to the horror unfolding before them, repeated the same tragic dance. It was a nightmare caught in an infinite loop, a purgatory from which there seemed to be no escape. As I attempted to leave the village, the very landscape seemed to warp and contort, redirecting me back into the heart of the cursed hamlet. No matter how far I walked, the village persisted, an inescapable labyrinth of sorrow and despair. The hooded figure, now gazing at me with empty eyes, beckoned me toward the trapdoor. The haunting melody swelled, and the shadows closed in around me. I felt an unseen force pulling me toward the abyss, the air filled with the anguished whispers of the forgotten. In that horrifying moment, I understood the true nature of the village's curse. I was destined to become the next sacrifice, my very existence to be erased from the fabric of reality. The hooded figure approached, and as its cold touch enveloped me, the village and its cursed inhabitants faded into darkness. Story 4. In the heart of the mist-shrouded town of Eldridge, where the streets seemed to coil and twist like the whispers of the wind, there stood an imposing mansion known as Blackthorn Manor. The locals spoke in hushed tones about its dark history, tales of an evil force that had gripped the mansion for generations. Intrigued by the rumors, I decided to delve into the enigma that was Blackthorn Manor and uncover the secrets it harbored. The mansion, veiled in a perpetual gloom, loomed at the edge of Eldridge like a sentinel of shadows. As I approached, the air grew heavy, and an unsettling feeling gripped me. The wrought iron gates groaned as I pushed them open, revealing a path overgrown with gnarled vines that seemed to writhe in silent agony. The entrance hall echoed with the creaking of the floorboards as I stepped into the oppressive darkness within Blackthorn Manor. Dust-laden furniture draped in white sheets loomed like ghostly sentinels. The air carried the musty scent of abandonment, and the silence was broken only by the distant murmur of the wind. As I traversed the mansion's labyrinthine corridors, the walls seemed to close in on me, their faded wallpaper peeling away to reveal the decaying structure beneath. Portraits of solemn-faced ancestors adorned the walls, their eyes following my every move with an eerie intensity. It was as if the very essence of the mansion observed my presence, judging me with a silent ill will. The deeper I ventured, the more the oppressive atmosphere intensified. The air itself seemed to thicken, laden with an unseen weight that pressed down on my shoulders. Whispers, indistinct and haunting, echoed through the halls, as if the very walls held secrets that refused to be forgotten. A grand staircase, its steps worn by the passage of time, beckoned me to the upper floors. The light cast long, twisted shadows that danced along the walls like specters in a macabre ballet. The silence was punctuated only by the distant howling of the wind, a mournful symphony that seemed to echo the mansion's desolation. In one of the rooms, I discovered an old study adorned with dusty, leather-bound books and tattered maps. The fireplace, though long extinguished, emanated a residual warmth that hinted at a bygone era. As I perused the books, a sense of dread settled in the pit of my stomach, as if the very knowledge within the room held a forceful power. The study, it seemed, belonged to a former owner of Blackthorn Manor, a scholar who had delved into forbidden realms of the occult. The pages spoke of eldritch rituals and dark pacts made in the shadows. The scholar's descent into madness, fueled by his insatiable quest for forbidden knowledge, was etched in the ink of the cursed tomes. Driven by an inexplicable compulsion, I continued my exploration, guided by the indistinct whispers that seemed to beckon me to the mansion's darkest corners. The walls seemed to absorb the very essence of my presence, and the air became charged with a palpable evil. In the heart of the mansion, I stumbled upon a forgotten ballroom, a vast expanse of faded opulence, its chandeliers hanging like grotesque ornaments. The air was thick with an unnatural chill, and the room seemed to pulse with a spectral energy. As I stepped further into the ballroom, the shadows seemed to come alive, coalescing into amorphous shapes that writhed and contorted. A ghastly apparition materialized at the center of the ballroom, a figure cloaked in tattered finery, its face obscured by the shadows. The specter moved with an ethereal grace, its movements echoing the remnants of a dance from a bygone era. The very air seemed to vibrate with the spectral waltz, a haunting melody that echoed through the chamber. The specter, its hollow gaze fixed upon me, beckoned me to join the spectral dance. The room itself seemed to pulsate with a dark energy, the walls closing in around me. A cold sweat broke out on my brow as an unseen force compelled me to become a part of the macabre ballet. As I danced with the spectral figure, the shadows enveloped us in an otherworldly embrace. The air became charged with a hateful force, and the very fabric of reality seemed to warp. The haunting melody reached a crescendo, and the room itself dissolved into an abyss of darkness. In that moment of disorienting blackness, I felt a searing pain, a wrenching sensation that tore at the very core of my being. The spectral dance had become a nightmarish descent into a void of suffering. The air echoed with the anguished cries of forgotten souls, and the shadows became a suffocating shroud that enveloped me in an eternal torment. The room, now a realm of perpetual darkness, resonated with the tormented whispers of the mansion's hostile history. The spectral figure, its features contorted in an eternal scream, loomed in the shadows, a harbinger of the horrors that lurked within Blackthorn Manor. And then, in a horrific revelation, the darkness consumed me entirely. I became one with the shadows, a tortured soul bound to the sinister force that gripped Blackthorn Manor. The echoes of my own screams joined the chorus of the forgotten, lost in the eternal abyss that lurked within the mansion's desolate halls. I had always imagined that the first year of marriage would be full of love, laughter, and adventure. My husband John and I were excited to begin this journey together. Little did we know that our adventure would take us to a place shrouded in mystery and darkness, a house with a history that had the townsfolk filled with fear. The house stood at the end of Willow Street, an imposing Victorian structure that loomed over the neighborhood. The moment we laid eyes on it, we fell in love. The high, arched windows, the ornate wooden details, and the sprawling garden in the back. Everything about the house was perfect. We were told that it had been empty for years, but no one seemed eager to share the reason. As we moved in, I couldn't help but feel a sense of trepidation. The house had an air of antiquity, with creaking floorboards and long, dark hallways. The previous owner had left behind old, dusty furniture that seemed to belong to another era. The entire place was a throwback to the 19th century. We spent our first few days unpacking and exploring our new home. The living room was adorned with a grand fireplace, and a beautiful chandelier hung from the ceiling. It was the perfect place for cozy evenings together. The kitchen, though outdated, had a charming feel, and I couldn't wait to cook our first meal there. The bedroom, with its heavy drapes and old-fashioned wardrobe, was both enchanting and slightly eerie. It wasn't long before strange occurrences began. At first, it was the soft whispers that seemed to emanate from the walls. John and I exchanged nervous glances as we tried to make out the words. The whispers were unintelligible, but they sounded like voices from another time. One evening, as we sat in the living room, we heard the whispers again. This time, I was certain that the voice said, "Help me." I shivered and looked at John, who had a concerned expression. He dismissed it as a draft or our imagination, but the unease lingered. As the weeks went by, the whispers grew more frequent. I decided to confide in our neighbor, Mrs. Davis, who had lived in the neighborhood for decades. She was known as the local historian and a keeper of town secrets. Mrs. Davis listened to my story with a knowing look. "That house, dear," she began. It has a history and not a pleasant one. It was built by a wealthy family in the late 1800s, the Chattertons. They were reclusive, strange people, and the townsfolk had always whispered about their dark practices. She paused for effect. The Chattertons dabbled in the occult, trying to communicate with the dead. They believed the house had a connection to the spirit world, and they performed rituals in the hopes of unlocking its secrets. My heart raced as I realized that the whispers we heard might be connected to the Chattertons' experiments. Mrs. Davis went on, "It said that they summoned a presence they couldn't control, and it cursed the house. After that, no one dared to live there, and the Chatterton family vanished without a trace." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The house we had so eagerly moved into had a dark and chilling history. But what could we do? We had just started our life together, and leaving wasn't an option. We decided to research the house's history and learn more about the Chatterton family. Our research led us to old newspaper clippings and journal entries from the late 1800s. The more we discovered, the more we realized the depth of the Chatterton family's obsession with the supernatural. They believed that the house was a portal to the afterlife and that they could communicate with the dead through seances and dark rituals. One journal in particular made my pulse rise. The whispers grow louder, and I fear we have awakened something dark. Shadows move through the house at night, and I've seen apparitions in the hallways. We must find a way to undo what we've done before it's too late. It was evident that the Chattertons had unleashed something beyond their control, and it had plagued the house ever since. As we delved deeper into the history, we couldn't ignore the increasing occurrences in the house. Doors would open and close on their own, and we heard footsteps in empty rooms. The whispers continued, and I couldn't help but feel that they were trying to tell us something. One night we awoke to the sound of a child crying. John rushed out of bed and followed the sound to the nursery. There he saw a faint, ghostly figure, a little girl in a white dress. She turned to him with tearful eyes, her voice trembling as she said, "Help me, please." As he reached out to touch her, she disappeared into thin air. John returned to our room, his face pale. "I saw her," he said, his voice shaking. "A little girl, just like the one from the old photographs we found in the attic. She was asking for help." We couldn't ignore the plea of the ghostly child any longer. We reached out to Mrs. Davis once more, hoping she could shed light on the mysterious girl. She listened intently and revealed that the Chattertons had a daughter, Emily, who had gone missing and was never found. It was believed that the entity they had summoned had taken her, and her spirit was trapped in the house. We realized that Emily's spirit was trying to communicate with us, asking for the help she never received in life. We couldn't turn our backs on her, and we decided to try and find a way to release her from the house's curse. Mrs. Davis suggested that we perform a ritual to free Emily's spirit. She explained that it would be a way to break the connection between the Chattertons' experiments and the trapped souls. We were hesitant but desperate to bring peace to the house. With Mrs. Davis's guidance, we gathered the necessary materials and prepared for the ritual. The air grew heavy as we lit candles, burned sage, and chanted incantations. The whispers in the walls grew louder and more frantic, as if the spirits were aware of our intentions. In the midst of the ritual, a chill filled the room and a shadowy figure appeared before us. It was Emily, her eyes filled with both fear and longing. She whispered, "Thank you," before slowly fading away, leaving behind an overwhelming sense of relief. As the ritual concluded, the house fell silent. The whispers were gone and the oppressive atmosphere lifted. It was as though the curse that had plagued the house for decades had finally been broken. We felt a sense of peace we had never experienced before. In the weeks that followed, the house no longer felt haunted. It was a place of warmth, and we could finally enjoy our marriage without the constant presence of restless spirits. Emily had found her release, and the darkness that had clung to the house had dissipated. Story 2. My name is Alex Holloway, and I never believed in ghosts until I moved into Hollywood House. I had inherited the old Victorian mansion from a distant relative I'd never met. The news of my sudden inheritance came as a shock, but the prospect of living in such a grand, historic house excited me. Little did I know that the house came with a history that would test the very limits of my skepticism. I had always considered myself a rational, level-headed person. I was an engineer by profession, and I approached life with a practical and analytical mindset. Ghost stories were nothing more than tales told around campfires designed to scare and amuse. But that was before I set foot in Hollywood House. The mansion sat atop a hill overlooking the sleepy town of Hollywood. The exterior was a sight to behold, with its ornate architecture, towering turrets, and sprawling gardens. It was a place that seemed to belong to a different era, and the townsfolk whispered about its dark past. The house had stood empty for as long as anyone could remember, and its imposing presence cast a shadow over the town. My first night in Hollywood House was a surreal experience. As I walked through the echoing hallways with a single flickering candle, I couldn't help but wonder about the stories I'd heard. People claimed to have seen figures in the windows at night, heard unexplained footsteps in the empty corridors, and witnessed lights flicker and doors open and close on their own. These were the tales that had earned the mansion its haunted reputation. I settled into one of the spacious bedrooms on the second floor, the large canopy bed and heavy drapes making me feel like I'd stepped into a period drama. As I lay in bed, I tried to dismiss the unease I felt. The wind whistled through the old windows, and the house seemed to sigh with its own ancient history. That night, as I drifted off to sleep, I heard it, a faint, distant whisper. I dismissed it as a trick of the wind or my own overactive imagination. But the whisper persisted, growing louder and more distinct. It was as though a voice from the past was trying to communicate with me. I strained my ears, and the words became clearer. "Help me," the voice pleaded, soft and trembling. My heart raced as I sat up in bed, my breaths coming quick and shallow. The voice sounded desperate, like a soul in torment. I leaped out of bed and searched the room, but there was no one to be found. The windows were shut tight and the doors were locked. I had heard the voice, there was no doubt about it, but its source remained a mystery. In the following days, I tried to put the incident out of my mind, convincing myself that it had been a vivid dream. I was determined not to let such irrational thoughts take hold of me. I delved into my work, focusing on renovations to make the house livable. However, the feeling of being watched and the whispers persisted. It was as though the house itself was trying to communicate with me, to tell me something I couldn't yet comprehend. One evening, as I was exploring the dusty attic, I came across a trove of old letters and journals. They were written by the previous inhabitants of Hollywood House, the Eldridges, who had lived there in the late 19th century. The journals were filled with accounts of strange occurrences that mirrored my own experiences. One of them caught my eye. The house is not what it seems. It harbors a presence that defies explanation. We hear the whispers at night, voices from another world, and the shadows move with a purpose we cannot comprehend. The house is cursed, and it hungers for something we cannot fathom. The journals were filled with similar stories, of doors that opened on their own, of apparitions in the hallways, and of voices that pleaded for help. The Eldridges had lived in constant fear, and they eventually abandoned the house, leaving it to decay. I couldn't ignore the striking similarities between their experiences and my own. The house was not just haunted, it was cursed, as if an insatiable darkness clung to its very foundations. As I continued my research, I learned that the house had been built on the site of a tragic event, a fire that had claimed the lives of several townspeople. It was said that the souls of those who had perished in the fire were never at rest, and their restless spirits haunted the mansion. My skepticism wavered as the evidence piled up. The history of Hollywood House was filled with inexplicable events and unexplained phenomena. It was clear that the house held secrets that defied logic and reason. One night, as I sat in the library, the whispers grew louder. They seemed to surround me, as if the walls themselves were trying to communicate. I strained to listen, and the voice became distinct, a woman's voice filled with anguish. "Help me," she implored, her words resonating with sorrow. I followed the voice to the grand staircase, where a shadowy figure materialized before me. It was a woman, her eyes filled with despair. She was dressed in a gown from a bygone era, and her form flickered in and out of existence. "My name is Eleanor," she said, her voice trembling. "I died in the fire, and my spirit has been trapped here ever since. You are our only hope." Eleanor's story was one of tragedy. She had been a resident of Hollywood, a young woman with dreams and aspirations, until the fateful night of the fire. She had perished along with others, and their spirits had been bound to the house, unable to find peace. I couldn't turn my back on Eleanor's plea for help. I reached out to a local historian, Mr. Thompson, who had spent years researching the history of Hollywood House. He explained that the house was a focal point for paranormal activity, a place where the veil between the living and the dead was thin. With Mr. Thompson's guidance, we decided to conduct a ritual to free the trapped souls and cleanse the house of its dark history. We gathered in the living room, surrounded by candles and incense, and recited incantations passed down through generations. As we chanted, the atmosphere grew heavy, and the air seemed to vibrate with energy. The whispers in the walls intensified, as if the spirits were aware of our intentions. I felt a presence in the room, a gathering of souls seeking release. Suddenly, the room grew icy cold, and the shadowy figures of the trapped souls materialized before us. Eleanor, along with others, stood in a solemn assembly, their eyes filled with gratitude and longing. The atmosphere was charged with emotion as we completed the ritual. The spirits began to fade, their forms dissolving into the ether. Eleanor's voice, filled with relief, echoed through the room. "Thank you," she whispered, and then she was gone. The house fell silent, and the weight of its cursed history seemed to lift. The whispers were gone, and the oppressive atmosphere had dissipated. I had not only inherited a haunted house, but had played a part in setting its restless souls free. In the weeks that followed, Hollywood House no longer felt haunted. It was a place of serenity, with no whispers or unexplained phenomena. The history of the mansion had changed from one of darkness to one of redemption. As I continued my life in Hollywood, I couldn't help but reflect on the mysteries of the house. I had learned that sometimes the unexplainable defied the rational mind. The spirits that had haunted the house were not malevolent, but trapped souls seeking release from their torment. I had been a part of their liberation, and the experience had forever altered my perception of the supernatural. Hollywood House, once a place of fear and uncertainty, had become a sanctuary of peace and redemption. Its history no longer whispered of despair, but of the resilience of the human spirit and the power of compassion and understanding. And as I looked out at the town of Hollywood from the mansion's grand windows, I knew that the house had found its own peace, and so had I. And as I looked out at the town of Hollywood from the mansion's grand windows, I knew that the house had found its own peace, and so had I. Story 3. Alex and Jess had purchased their dream home, an old charming cottage nestled in a picturesque countryside. The house had a unique character with its exposed wooden beams, stone fireplace, and a sense of history that seemed to seep through its walls. They believed it was the perfect place to start their life together. As they settled into their new home, they couldn't help but feel a sense of wonder and excitement. The cottage held so much potential, and they looked forward to making it their own. But their journey of discovery would soon take an eerie turn. One sunny afternoon, while Alex was inspecting the basement for any needed repairs, he noticed an unusual gap in the stone wall that seemed out of place. Curiosity piqued, he investigated further and discovered a hidden door. It was concealed behind a stack of old crates and almost impossible to spot. Alex and Jess worked together to pry the door open, revealing a narrow, dusty corridor that led to a small, forgotten room. The room was filled with cobwebs, and the air was heavy with the scent of age. But what captured their attention most was an old, leather-bound diary sitting on a dusty wooden table in the center of the room. The diary was dated from the early 1900s and belonged to a woman named Eleanor. As they began to read, they became engrossed in the life of the previous occupant. Eleanor had lived in the cottage with her husband, Arthur, and their young daughter, Emily. Eleanor's entries chronicled the family's life, but as they read further, they encountered disturbing details. Eleanor wrote of a mysterious presence in the house, one that seemed to manifest in the form of eerie whispers, inexplicable drafts of cold air, and objects moving on their own. The entries grew more frantic as Eleanor described sleepless nights and a growing sense of dread. She mentioned hearing voices that urged her to leave the cottage, warning her that something malevolent resided within its walls. But she and Arthur were determined to keep their home and protect their daughter. As Alex and Jess continued to read, they noticed a pattern in Eleanor's entries, the mention of a secret room hidden in the basement. Eleanor believed that whatever haunted their home was tied to that hidden space. She wrote of her plans to uncover its mysteries, but the diary abruptly stopped. Alex and Jess were both intrigued and unnerved by the diary's contents. They decided to investigate the hidden room mentioned by Eleanor, feeling compelled to uncover the truth about the haunting. With flashlights in hand, they descended into the basement and followed the narrow corridor to the secret room. It was locked, and after some effort, they managed to pry it open. The room was small and dimly lit, with stone walls covered in strange symbols and a feeling of oppressive energy that sent shivers down their spines. On a rickety wooden shelf, they discovered a series of old journals that had belonged to Arthur. As they skimmed through the entries, a chilling narrative began to emerge. Arthur had continued where Eleanor left off, documenting his own experiences with the malevolent force that haunted the house. He wrote of being tormented by vivid nightmares, of feeling a cold, clammy hand brushing against him in the dead of night, and of witnessing objects levitating and crashing to the ground. The journals contained pleas for help and prayers for deliverance. As Alex and Jess read on, they realized that Arthur had become obsessed with uncovering the source of the haunting, the secret room. He believed that the key to freeing their family from the malevolent entity lay within its hidden walls. With trembling hands, they turned their attention to the room itself. They searched for any hidden compartments or clues that might lead them to the truth. It was then that Alex noticed a loose stone in the wall, and when he pushed it aside, they revealed a small concealed chamber. Inside, they found a wooden chest covered in dust and cobwebs. With bated breath, they opened it, revealing a collection of old photographs, letters, and a small weathered doll that sent a chill down their spines. The doll bore a striking resemblance to Emily, the daughter mentioned in Eleanor's diary. As they examined the contents of the chest, they realized that it held the remnants of a tragic family history, a history that had somehow become intertwined with the malevolent presence in the house. Determined to uncover the truth and put an end to the haunting, Alex and Jess continued their research. They reached out to a local historian who delved into the history of the cottage and its previous occupants. What they discovered was a heartbreaking tale of a family torn apart by tragedy. Eleanor and Arthur had indeed lived in the cottage with their young daughter, Emily. But Emily had mysteriously disappeared one fateful night, never to be found again. The heartbreak of losing their child had shattered the family, and the malevolent presence that had haunted the house was believed to be the spirit of Emily, trapped in a state of torment and confusion. With this knowledge in hand, Alex and Jess decided to hold a seance in the hidden room, hoping to communicate with the spirit of Emily and offer her the peace and closure she so desperately needed. As they gathered in the dimly lit room, surrounded by the symbols on the walls, they reached out to Emily's spirit. Through the seance, they managed to establish a connection with her, and the room filled with a palpable sense of sorrow and longing. Emily's spirit conveyed her confusion and fear, revealing that she had been trying to reach out to her parents for years, but her efforts had only fueled their terror. She longed for her family's forgiveness and for a way to move on from the torment that bound her to the house. With tears in their eyes, Alex and Jess assured Emily that they understood her pain and were willing to help. They performed a ritual to guide her spirit towards the light, offering words of forgiveness and love. As they completed the ritual, the room seemed to brighten and a sense of peace washed over them. They knew that Emily's spirit had finally found the release it had yearned for. In the days that followed, the cottage felt different. The oppressive presence had vanished, replaced by a sense of serenity and warmth. Alex and Jess knew that they had played a crucial role in bringing closure to a long-forgotten tragedy. They decided to preserve the hidden room as a place of remembrance for Emily, a testament to her enduring spirit. The cottage, once haunted by a painful history, had now become a place of healing and redemption. Story 4. David, a talented musician, had always dreamt of having his private recording studio. When he stumbled upon an old mansion in a quiet countryside, he saw the perfect opportunity to turn his dream into reality. The mansion was a grand and imposing structure, with high vaulted ceilings and ornate architecture, a perfect setting for his creative endeavors. As David began setting up his recording equipment in the mansion's grand living room, he couldn't help but marvel at the acoustics and the rich, warm sound that filled the space. It was as if the very walls of the house resonated with music. Late one night, as David was tinkering with his instruments and recording software, he heard the faint strains of a piano melody. At first, he dismissed it as a product of his tired imagination, but the music persisted, growing clearer and more enchanting with each passing moment. Following the haunting melody, David found himself drawn to a locked room on the second floor. It was a room he had never noticed before, and the door was adorned with intricate carvings of musical notes and instruments. The room seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy. Determined to uncover the source of the haunting music, David searched the mansion for a key. After a thorough investigation, he discovered an old brass key tucked away in a dusty drawer. With trepidation and excitement, he inserted the key into the door's lock, and it creaked open to reveal a room frozen in time. The room was a magnificent music chamber, with a grand piano at its center. The walls were adorned with portraits of composers long past, and sheet music was scattered across the polished wooden floor. It was as if the room had been untouched for centuries. As David approached the grand piano, he noticed a journal resting on its dusty surface. The journal belonged to a composer named Victor, and it detailed his obsession with a symphony he had never been able to finish. A symphony that was meant to be his masterpiece. Victor's entries spoke of a mysterious muse who had inspired him with hauntingly beautiful melodies. He described the muse as a ghostly presence that would visit him in the dead of night, whispering enchanting compositions into his ear. As David read on, he realized that Victor had been consumed by his desire to complete the symphony. He had isolated himself from the world, pouring all his creative energy into the haunting melodies that had been gifted to him by the enigmatic muse. But Victor's obsession had taken a toll on his sanity. He wrote of sleepless nights, of hearing the muse's voice even during waking hours, and of a growing darkness that seemed to overshadow his life. David felt a deep connection to Victor's story, as if he understood the composer's yearning for creative perfection. He decided to honor Victor's memory and complete the unfinished symphony, believing that it was his destiny to bring the haunting music to life. With each passing day, David dedicated himself to the symphony, spending hours at the grand piano, composing and refining the melodies that had been left incomplete for so long. The music seemed to flow effortlessly, as if guided by an unseen hand. But as David delved deeper into the symphony, he began to experience strange occurrences. He would hear whispers in the empty rooms, voices that seemed to echo the haunting melodies he was composing. Shadows danced in his peripheral vision, and he often felt a chilling presence watching over him. One night, as he sat alone in the music chamber, absorbed in the composition, he felt a cold, ethereal hand gently touch his shoulder. Startled, he turned to see a ghostly figure. A woman dressed in a flowing gown, her eyes filled with a mixture of longing and sorrow. The figure extended her hand toward David, and without hesitation he reached out and touched it. As their hands met, he felt a surge of emotions, loss, passion, and an unfulfilled yearning for completion. Through the connection, David understood that the ghostly woman was the muse who had inspired Victor. She had longed for her symphony to be brought to life, to be heard by the world, and to find closure for her own unfinished story. Determined to honor the muse's wishes, David continued his work on the symphony, pouring his heart and soul into the haunting melodies. As he composed the final notes, he felt a profound sense of fulfillment, as if he had completed a journey that had spanned centuries. The night he performed the finished symphony in the grand living room of the mansion, a sense of transcendence filled the air. The music flowed through the space, carrying with it the emotions and yearnings of the muse. It was a symphony that spoke of love, loss, and the eternal quest for artistic perfection. As the last note faded into silence, David felt a gentle breeze caress his cheek, and he knew that the muse had finally found peace. The mansion, once haunted by the specter of creative obsession, now resonated with a sense of artistic fulfillment. David continued to use the mansion as his recording studio, but he always left the music chamber untouched, as a testament to the creative journey he had embarked on and the connection he had forged with the haunting muse. Story 5. The day we moved into Sterling House was like any other. The sun cast long shadows on the lawn as we carried our boxes through the creaking front door. My husband David and I had always dreamed of owning an old Victorian house, and Sterling House was the embodiment of that dream. It was a stately 3-story structure with a wraparound porch, intricate woodwork, and a history that whispered through its weathered walls. Our 2 children, Emily and Daniel, were thrilled at the idea of living in such a grand house, though there was one peculiar aspect that gave them pause. The townsfolk had whispered about the house, calling it haunted and cursed. They claimed it was a place of restless spirits and unexplained events. But we dismissed these stories as mere superstition, eager to start our new life. The first night in Sterling House was quiet and uneventful. We gathered in the cozy, old-fashioned living room to celebrate our new beginning. The fireplace crackled with life, and Emily and Daniel played with their toys. The only thing that seemed odd was the faint odor of roses that lingered in the air, but we attributed it to some old potpourri left behind by the previous owners. That night, as we settled into our respective rooms, I couldn't help but marvel at the house's character. The rooms were spacious, and the moonlight filtered through the lace curtains, casting intricate patterns on the hardwood floors. I fell asleep to the soothing sound of the wind rustling through the leaves outside. But then, in the dead of night, I was jolted awake by a soft, distant whisper. It was so faint that I couldn't make out the words. I lay in bed, straining my ears, but the voice disappeared as quickly as it had come. I shook off the cold feeling, blaming it on my imagination running wild. Over the next few weeks, strange things began to happen. Emily started having vivid nightmares, waking up in tears, speaking of a dark figure at the foot of her bed. Daniel claimed he saw his toys move on their own and heard whispers in the hallways. I too experienced the whispered voices at odd hours, and the scent of roses became more pronounced. David, ever the skeptic, brushed off our concerns, attributing it to stress and our overactive imaginations. He urged us to embrace the house's charm and history, rather than fear its supposed hauntings. One day, while I was cleaning out the attic, I came across a stack of old, dusty journals. They were filled with the handwritten thoughts and experiences of previous residents. The entries were a mix of mundane daily life and accounts of strange occurrences that mirrored our own. One sentence from the year 1923 stood out. "The whispers persist, and I can't bear to sleep in the master bedroom anymore. The scent of roses lingers, and I often feel a cold presence by my side. I know not what haunts this house, but I am certain it is not of this world." The journal was filled with similar stories, and it sent a cold breeze down my back. I shared my discovery with David, who, despite his skepticism, couldn't deny the scary connection between our experiences and those of the previous residents. As our unease grew, we decided to investigate the house's history. We discovered that a family named the Sterlings had lived in the house for generations until it was sold to the family we had purchased it from. The Sterlings had been prominent in the town, known for their wealth and power. Rumor had it that the family had a dark side, dabbling in the occult and dark practices. Determined to put an end to the unsettling occurrences, we decided to contact a local historian to learn more about the Sterling family's past. The historian, Mrs. Anderson, was a frail, elderly woman with a wealth of knowledge about the town's history. She invited us to her home to share her findings. Mrs. Anderson's living room was filled with ancient books and dusty tomes. She began to recount the history of the Sterlings, explaining that they had been obsessed with the occult and the afterlife. They were rumored to have performed dark rituals within the house, and it was said that they had communed with the dead. The Sterlings were searching for something beyond the realm of the living, Mrs. Anderson said. They believed that the house held a gateway to another world, and their experiments were their attempt to bridge the gap between life and death. As she spoke, I couldn't help but wonder if the strange occurrences we'd experienced were somehow linked to the Sterling family's obsession with the supernatural. Mrs. Anderson offered to help us cleanse the house and rid it of any lingering negative energy. She explained that we needed to perform a ritual that would break the connection between our world and the other side. That night we gathered in the living room, the hearth crackling with a warm fire. Mrs. Anderson led the ritual, guiding us through each step. We lit candles, burned sage, and recited incantations to banish any lingering spirits. As we chanted, the air grew heavy and the scent of roses became overpowering. A soft wind rustled through the curtains. Suddenly, the temperature in the room dropped and a shadowy figure materialized before us. It was a woman, her eyes hollow and sorrowful. She seemed to be from another time, dressed in a gown reminiscent of the early 1900s. Her presence made my blood freeze. The figure spoke in a soft, mournful voice. "You have awakened me from my slumber. I am Isabella Sterling, and I have been trapped in this house for eternity. The experiments of my family tethered me to this realm, and I have longed for release." Tears welled up in her eyes as she told us her story. Isabella explained that she had been an innocent victim of her family's dark pursuits. They had used her as a vessel to communicate with the dead, and her spirit had been bound to the house ever since. We felt a deep sympathy for Isabella, trapped in a liminal state between life and death. Mrs. Anderson continued the ritual, beseeching Isabella to find peace and move on to the afterlife. Isabella's form began to waver, and her voice faded as she gradually disappeared into the ether. The room grew still and the scent of roses lifted. It was as though the weight of centuries had been lifted from Sterling House. We completed the ritual, ensuring that Isabella's spirit had found the release it had longed for. In the days that followed, the house felt different. The air was lighter, and the unsettling occurrences ceased. Emily and Daniel's nightmares subsided, and the whispers that had haunted us for weeks disappeared. It was as if the house had been cleansed of its dark past. Sterling House, once a place of fear and uncertainty, had become a warm and welcoming home. Isabella's presence no longer lingered, and the history that had whispered through its walls was now a distant echo. We had finally found peace in our new home. As the years passed, we cherished our time in Sterling House. It had become a place of happiness. Story 6. Sarah and Mark had always dreamed of owning a charming old house with character. So, when they stumbled upon a dilapidated Victorian mansion tucked away on a quiet street, they couldn't believe their luck. The place was a mess, but they saw its potential. With determination, they began the renovations. The first few weeks went smoothly as they painted walls, replaced floorboards, and restored the grand staircase. But then, strange things started happening. One evening, Sarah left her paintbrush on the kitchen counter while she went to fetch a glass of water. When she returned, the brush was on the floor and the faucet was running. She assumed it was Mark playing a prank, but he denied it. As days turned into weeks, the occurrences became more unsettling. Tools would vanish only to reappear in odd places. Eerie whispers echoed through the empty hallways at night, and both Sarah and Mark felt a constant chill in the air, no matter how high they turned up the heating. One evening, as they relaxed in the living room after a long day's work, they heard the creaking of footsteps on the stairs above. Their hearts pounded as they looked at each other, both thinking the same thing. Mark grabbed a flashlight and they crept up the staircase, their footsteps echoing through the hollow house. The upper floor was dark, save for the occasional flicker of a candle-like glow that seemed to be moving ahead of them. Following the eerie light, they found themselves in a dusty, neglected room. There, in the corner, stood an old trunk. As Mark opened it, they found a series of handwritten letters tied with a faded ribbon. The letters were dated from the early 1900s and were addressed to a woman named Margaret. The letters spoke of a forbidden love affair between Margaret and a man named Samuel. Margaret's husband, it seemed, had discovered their secret, leading to a terrible tragedy. The final letter hinted at a curse placed upon the house, a curse that would torment anyone who dared to live within its walls. Sarah and Mark were horrified by what they had uncovered. They couldn't believe they had stumbled upon such a dark secret hidden within their dream home. But they couldn't deny the escalating paranormal activity that had plagued them since they began the renovations. Fearing for their safety, they decided to leave the house, but the malevolent presence wasn't ready to let them go. As they packed their belongings, a sudden gust of icy wind blew through the room, extinguishing the candles and plunging them into darkness. Terrified, they stumbled toward the door, but it slammed shut before they could escape. The room seemed to come alive, with furniture floating in the air and ghostly figures appearing all around them. Desperate and overwhelmed, they clung to each other, reciting prayers and begging for release from the vengeful spirits. Finally, as the clock struck midnight, the apparitions vanished, and the oppressive atmosphere lifted. Sarah and Mark fled the house, never looking back. They left behind their dream home, realizing that some dreams are better left unfulfilled, especially when they come with a curse. As they stood outside in the cold night air, the full moon casting an eerie glow on the old Victorian mansion. Story 7. When Emma inherited her grandmother's Victorian mansion, she saw it as an opportunity for a fresh start. The house stood nestled among ancient oaks, its exterior adorned with intricate gingerbread trim. Memories of childhood visits filled her with nostalgia, and she couldn't wait to restore the place to its former glory. As she explored the house, memories of her grandmother flooded back. Warm evenings in the garden, the comforting scent of her famous apple pie, and the soothing lullabies that used to fill the air. Yet beneath these cherished memories, Emma couldn't help but remember the stories her grandmother had whispered to her as a child, the stories of a haunting that had plagued the family for generations. One evening, as Emma was sifting through her grandmother's old belongings in the attic, she stumbled upon a stack of dusty journals. These journals, she soon realized, were her grandmother's personal diaries, filled with tales of strange occurrences and her growing fear of the house. The entries described chilling encounters with unseen entities, mysterious shadows that roamed the hallways at night, and whispers that seemed to emanate from the very walls. Emma's grandmother wrote of a sense of being watched, of a malevolent presence that seemed to feed off her fear. As Emma delved deeper into the journals, she discovered that her grandmother had sought the help of mediums, psychics, and even priests to rid the house of the malevolent force. But all attempts had been in vain, and her grandmother's descent into madness was palpable in the later entries. Haunted by her grandmother's words, Emma decided to investigate further. She contacted a paranormal researcher named Dr. Richard Thornton, who specialized in cases involving haunted properties. Dr. Thornton agreed to visit the mansion and conduct a thorough investigation. On a stormy night with rain pounding against the windows and thunder rumbling in the distance, Dr. Thornton arrived at the mansion. Emma greeted him at the door, her anxiety evident. Together, they ventured into the heart of the house, armed with cameras, voice recorders, and a sense of trepidation. As they began their investigation, strange occurrences manifested themselves. Doors creaked open on their own, and cold spots seemed to materialize out of thin air. Dr. Thornton's equipment detected fluctuations in electromagnetic fields, and eerie EVPs, electronic voice phenomena, whispered chilling messages. In the attic, where Emma had discovered her grandmother's journals, the activity reached its peak. The air grew heavy with a palpable sense of dread, and the temperature dropped dramatically. Emma felt a presence close by, as if someone, or something, was watching her every move. Dr. Thornton conducted a series of seances and communicated with the entities using a spirit board. Through these interactions, they learned that the malevolent force had a name: Elijah. Elijah claimed to be a tortured soul who had died tragically in the house long ago, and had been bound to it ever since. Emma, filled with empathy, tried to understand Elijah's pain and the reason behind his malevolence. As the hours passed, she and Dr. Thornton unraveled the tragic tale of a love affair gone awry, one that had led to Elijah's untimely death and his eternal torment. It became apparent that Elijah sought release from the curse that bound him to the house. With Dr. Thornton's guidance, Emma decided to help. They performed a ritual to communicate with Elijah's spirit and guide him towards the light. It was a fraught and emotional process, filled with fear and uncertainty. As the ritual reached its climax, a blinding light enveloped the attic and a sense of profound peace washed over them. Emma could feel Elijah's presence receding, and she knew that he had finally found the release he had longed for. With the curse lifted, the house felt different, lighter, as if a weight had been lifted from its foundations. The paranormal activity ceased, and Emma could finally breathe a sigh of relief. She decided to continue her grandmother's legacy by turning the mansion into a small bed and breakfast, sharing the history of the house and its spirits with those who dared to stay. Emma knew that her grandmother's tragic story was finally at an end, and she had played a part in bringing peace to the restless spirits that had haunted the old Victorian mansion for generations. The sun rose above the rugged terrain, casting a golden hue upon the vast expanse of wilderness that stretched as far as the eye could see. A group of friends, bound by adventure and camaraderie, embarked on a hiking trip, an escapade into the heart of nature's embrace. Among them were Rachel, Alex, Emily, and Mark, a quartet united by their shared love for the outdoors. The trail snaked through dense woods, each step a testament to their exhilaration and the thrill of exploration. However, what started as an adventure into the untamed wilderness soon turned into a haunting ordeal. As the day waned and the sun dipped below the horizon, an unsettling sensation crept upon the group, a worrying presence that lingered at the edges of their consciousness. Unease settled like a shroud over the campsite, as inexplicable incidents disrupted the tranquility of the night. Subtle rustles in the underbrush, fleeting shadows in the moonlight, whispers of an unseen stalker silently tracking their every move. Paranoia simmered among the friends, festering into a brew of fear and suspicion. What was that? Rachel's voice trembled, a note of uncertainty lacing her words as she scanned the darkened woodland. Probably just a small animal, Alex reassured her. But the unease lingered, a palpable tension that hung heavy in the air. With every passing hour, the sense of being watched intensified. Mysterious scratches marred the tent flaps, and faint echoes of footsteps resonated through the night, a haunting symphony that amplified the group's apprehension. As dawn broke, the friends convened, their faces etched with concern. They resolved to explore the surrounding area, seeking to dispel the looming specter of paranoia that had eclipsed their once joyous adventure. However, the wilderness offered no solace, only a silence that seemed to mock their futile attempts to unravel the mystery. In their search, they stumbled upon cryptic markings etched upon tree trunks, an omen that hinted at a menacing presence lurking within the woods. Emily's voice quivered as she pointed to the symbols etched upon the bark. "What does this mean? Is someone following us?" Mark's attempts to allay their fears fell upon deaf ears, for the unspoken dread had woven its tendrils into the fabric of their minds. The stalker's intentions remained shrouded in uncertainty, the wilderness echoing with silent threats that haunted their every step. As dusk descended upon the landscape, a realization dawned upon the group. Their stalker was not a mere observer, but a creepy force, their intentions as enigmatic as the symbols that adorned the trees. In a desperate bid to evade the unseen pursuer, the friends pressed on, their pace quickening as the ominous silence of the woods grew deafening. Yet the stalker's presence loomed closer, an intangible cruelness that cast a pall over their flight. A piercing scream shattered the tranquility of the woods. Rachel's voice echoed through the foliage, a harrowing cry that bore the weight of impending terror. The group rushed to her aid, their hearts pounding with dread as they found her trembling, a terrified gaze fixed upon the surrounding wilderness. "There was someone there," Rachel gasped, her words choked with fear. "A figure, lurking in the shadows." Panic seized the group, their resolve splintering in the face of the encounter. The stalker's unseen menace had materialized, its intentions veiled in the sinister echoes of the wilderness. As they attempted to flee, a haunting realization settled upon them. Trapped within the labyrinth of the woods, they were at the mercy of an adversary whose intentions remained shrouded in the enigma of the wilderness. The harrowing ordeal culminated in an unspoken understanding. Their stalker's identity would forever remain an unsolved mystery, and the echoes of that haunting night in the wilderness would linger as a testament to the unfathomable horrors that nature could conceal. With hearts racing and fear clawing at their souls, they bolted through the dense undergrowth, their frenzied escape echoing through the woods, a final attempt to outrun the ominous presence that stalked their every move. Yet as the darkness enveloped them, the chilling reality lingered, an unresolved terror that lurked within the wilderness, a haunting reminder that the untamed wild could harbor the darkest of secrets. The group, gripped by terror, navigated the dense thicket, their strides frantic as they attempted to outpace the unseen menace. With each passing moment, the veil of darkness deepened, obscuring their path and amplifying their sense of desperation. Emily's breaths came in ragged gasps as she stumbled over roots and fallen branches, her heart pounding in synchrony with the frenetic rhythm of the forest. She glanced over her shoulder, her eyes wide with fear, half expecting to glimpse the silhouette that haunted their every step. "We can't keep running blindly." Mark's voice, tinged with urgency, cut through the cacophony of their panicked flight. "We need to find shelter, regroup, and figure this out." His words resonated with the semblance of reason, a flicker of hope amidst the encroaching darkness. They veered off the trail, seeking refuge amid the snarl of trees, their hearts burdened by the lingering presence of their unknown pursuer. As they huddled together, the forest seemed to draw them into its embrace, the night alive with whispers that stirred the foliage and rustled the leaves in a haunting symphony. Every snap of a twig and every distant howl of the wind carried with it the ominous echo of their pursuer's unseen presence. Shrouded in the suffocating embrace of uncertainty, the friends attempted to piece together the fragmented events that had culminated in their harrowing flight. But their attempts at coherence were thwarted by the palpable dread that pervaded their sanctuary, the fear palpable in their shared silence. Hours stretched into an unsettling vigil, each passing minute weighed down by the oppressive atmosphere of the forest. Anxiety gnawed at their resolve, fraying the fragile threads of hope that bound them together. Amidst the suffocating tension, a faint rustling interrupted the silence, a subtle yet unmistakable indication that their unseen pursuer lingered in the shadows, observing their desperate plight. "Who's there?" Alex's voice quivered, a trembling plea for answers in the face of an implacable adversary. The forest offered no response, the silence a testament to the enigmatic terror that lurked within its depths. Paralyzed by fear, the friends huddled closer, their unity their sole defense against the unknown menace that encircled them. As the night wore on, a distant glimmer of dawn cast a faint light upon the horizon, the promise of a new day tainted by the lingering dread that had consumed their once carefree excursion. A sudden realization dawned upon them, a somber acknowledgement that their stalker's identity would remain forever veiled within the shroud of the wilderness. With a heavy heart burdened by unresolved terror, they mustered the remnants of their courage to resume their journey out of the treacherous woods. The trek back to civilization was fraught with trepidation, every rustle in the underbrush and every gust of wind a haunting reminder of the peril they had narrowly escaped. Finally emerging from the suffocating embrace of the forest, the friends stood at the threshold of safety, their faces etched with relief tinged by the haunting memories of the night that had forever altered their perception of the untamed wild. Their experience remained an unspoken testament, an unsettling reminder that within the pristine tranquility of nature's embrace, there existed an unfathomable terror that could ensnare the unwary, leaving behind an indelible mark of fear and uncertainty. Story 2. The towering skyscraper of Tenebris Enterprises loomed over the bustling city, its sleek glass exterior reflecting the chaotic hum of corporate ambition that permeated within. Among the sea of ambitious professionals navigating the jungle of cubicles, Claire Hastings stood as a rising star, a dedicated and focused asset to the company's marketing division. Claire's routine at Tenebris had been methodical until the arrival of peculiar notes that disrupted her semblance of normalcy. It started innocuously, with the first note slipping beneath her office door, a cryptic message that hinted at personal details, secrets only privy to her thoughts. The message bore an unsettling familiarity, a revelation that pierced the facade of professional decorum. As the days passed, the notes increased in frequency, each revealing intimate aspects of Claire's life, details that no one within the company should possess. Fear gripped her heart, transforming the once familiar office environment into a claustrophobic maze of paranoia. Every passerby seemed a potential threat, every corner harboring an unseen observer. The whispers of her colleagues became ominous murmurs, their glances laden with suspicion and curiosity. Desperate for answers, Claire navigated the harrowing corridors of her past, searching for a connection to the unsettling messages that had infiltrated her professional sanctuary. Yet her past remained shrouded in secrecy, offering no solace or explanation for the invasive scrutiny she faced. As the stalker's relentless pursuit escalated, Claire's work suffered, her once sharp focus clouded by the suffocating grip of fear. The notes became increasingly sinister, the stalker's intentions veiled in menacing implications. One fateful evening, as the office lay bathed in a silence, Claire lingered behind to confront the unseen adversary haunting her professional existence. The flickering fluorescent lights cast elongated shadows that danced along the corridors, mirroring the unsettling uncertainty that loomed over her. In a daring attempt to unveil the identity of her tormentor, Claire ventured into the deserted office, each step a testament to her resolve to unravel the mystery. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of her racing heartbeat echoing through the vacant halls. A figure emerged from the shadows, a phantom draped in darkness, their features obscured by the veil of obscurity. Claire's pulse quickened, a visceral combination of terror and determination urging her forward. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice wavering but resolute, seeking the answers that had eluded her. The figure remained silent, a spectral presence that seemed to blend seamlessly with the surrounding darkness. A flicker of recognition surged within Claire, a haunting familiarity that sent a cold drop of sweat down her neck. Before she could comprehend the implications, the figure dissipated into the maze depths of the office, leaving Claire enveloped in a silence that reverberated with the sinister revelation. The encounter had offered no closure, only a haunting realization, a truth that clawed at the recesses of her mind. The stalker's ominous warning lingered, a reminder that the shadows within the workplace held secrets far more insidious than she had ever dared to imagine. As the night descended upon the office, Claire stood alone, her thoughts engulfed in a tempest of unanswered questions. The confrontation had left her ensnared in an unsettling uncertainty, a claustrophobic maze of fear where the stalker's identity remained an elusive enigma, an unresolved terror that haunted the very corridors she navigated each day. The office, once a bastion of professional aspiration, now harbored shadows that whispered dark secrets, secrets that threatened to consume Claire in an inescapable network of fear and uncertainty. Haunted by the encounter, Claire found herself in a relentless pursuit for answers. Days turned into nights, and nights blurred into restless slumber, haunted by recurring visions of the enigmatic figure shrouded in darkness. The workplace, once a thriving hub of productivity, had transformed into an ominous maze of paranoia. Every glance felt like an accusation, every whispered conversation a potential harbinger of impending doom. Claire's professional persona had become a mere facade, veiling the harrowing turmoil that raged within her. Determined to unmask the identity of her tormentor, Claire embarked on a relentless investigation, meticulously scrutinizing her professional and personal circles for any semblance of connection to the mysterious stalker. But the elusive figure remained an enigma, a specter that lingered at the periphery of her consciousness. Amid the tormenting uncertainty, Claire sought refuge in the solace of a trusted confidant, her longtime colleague and friend, Alex. She confided in him, divulging the haunting saga that had plunged her life into disarray. Alex listened intently, a furrow creasing his brow as Claire recounted the events that had unfolded within the confines of their workplace. "Claire, this is disturbing," Alex murmured, concern etched on his features. "Let me help you. We'll figure this out together." The prospect of an ally in her battle against the unknown invigorated Claire with a renewed sense of hope. Together they combed through the intricacies of Claire's life, piecing together fragments of past encounters and acquaintances, in a fervent attempt to unmask the stalker's identity. The days quickly turned into weeks, and the relentless pursuit for answers cast a suffocating veil over Claire's existence. Yet, amidst the twist of uncertainties, a breakthrough emerged, an unexpected connection that illuminated the dim recesses of her memory. A memory, long relegated to the depths of forgotten encounters, surfaced. An encounter with a former colleague, whose presence had once been an inconsequential blip in Claire's professional trajectory. As realization dawned, Claire's heart raced with a tumultuous blend of dread and resolution. She discovered unsettling truths buried within the forgotten contours of her past, a past entwined with fractured relationships and veiled intentions. Summoning the vestiges of courage that had been obscured by fear, Claire confronted the former colleague, the figure who had once been a fleeting shadow within her professional sphere. "You." Claire's voice trembled with a mixture of accusation and apprehension as she confronted the figure who stood before her, their presence once innocuous but now shrouded in malice. The former colleague's features contorted into a chilling smirk, a haunting echo of Claire's suspicions. "You never saw it coming, did you?" they taunted, their voice dripping with vindictive satisfaction. Claire's pulse quickened, a jarring realization settling like an icy weight in the pit of her stomach. The stalker's identity, once concealed within the familiar contours of her workplace, had finally emerged from the shadows. Before she could muster a response, the figure disappeared into the depths of the office, leaving Claire ensnared in an unsettling epiphany. An epiphany that the true horror was not in the identity of the stalker, but in the disquieting revelation that the corridors she once navigated with confidence had harbored treachery and deception. The confrontation had unraveled the mystery, yet it left Claire burdened with the realization that the workplace menace she had faced was not merely an external threat. It was a sinister manifestation of betrayal lurking within the very fabric of her professional domain. As the office lay enveloped in the silence of the night, Claire stood alone, the haunting truth gnawing at her spirit. The stalker's identity had been unmasked, yet the true horror lay in the shadows cast by the echoes of deceit. A haunting reminder that the darkest threats often lurk within the corridors we least expect. Story 3. The sprawling campus of Arden University buzzed with the excitement of academia, its vibrant atmosphere a sanctuary for aspiring minds seeking knowledge and enlightenment. Among the throng of students, Sarah Adams navigated the corridors of higher learning, her academic pursuits overshadowed by an insidious presence that lurked within the campus's confines. It started with inconspicuous notes, cryptic messages that materialized in Sarah's dorm room, warning her of an unseen observer who had infiltrated her academic haven. Initially dismissive, Sarah attributed the notes to a misguided prank, a fleeting disturbance in the otherwise serene ambiance of campus life. However, the notes grew increasingly malevolent, each message bearing a menacing undertone that unsettled Sarah's peace of mind. Intrusive evidence of stalking emerged, subtle but invasive clues that hinted at a relentless pursuer weaving through the very fabric of her academic and personal existence. Sinister shadows seemed to dance at the periphery of Sarah's vision, a dark reminder of the pervasive threat that encroached upon her sanctuary of learning. Paranoia gnawed at her consciousness, a haunting uncertainty that reverberated through every corridor and lecture hall. As the stalker's relentless pursuit intensified, Sarah's academic aspirations faltered, her once ardent passion for learning overshadowed by the suffocating fear that ensnared her. The campus, once a bastion of intellectual growth, transformed into a web of shadows where every face became a potential adversary. Desperate for answers, Sarah sought solace in the confines of her friendships. Yet the insidious presence remained elusive, a ghostly entity manipulating the very fabric of her existence within the university's hallowed halls. With unease etched upon her features, Sarah confided in her closest confidant, Emily, divulging the saga that had shattered her collegiate tranquility. Emily, alarmed by the gravity of Sarah's plight, resolved to uncover the identity of the relentless stalker. Together they embarked on a perilous quest for truth, scouring the campus for clues that would unmask the hateful specter haunting Sarah's academic sanctuary. Yet, the stalker's cunning evaded their pursuit, leaving behind a trail of cryptic messages that taunted their futile efforts. One ominous evening, as dusk cloaked the campus in an eerie twilight, Sarah found herself ensnared in a confrontation, an encounter that would forever alter her perception of the seemingly idyllic academic domain. The stalker materialized, a spectral figure shrouded in darkness, their features obscured by the veil of anonymity. Sarah's heart raced with a palpable dread as the stalker's voice reverberated through the deserted courtyard. "You thought you could escape me." The voice, laced with malice, echoed through the corridors of Sarah's terror-stricken mind. Before Sarah could comprehend the gravity of the situation, the figure vanished into the night, leaving behind an unsettling void, an unresolved terror that lingered within the very walls of her collegiate refuge. As the night descended upon the campus, Sarah stood alone, the encounter a haunting reminder of the shadows that lurked within the seemingly tranquil abode of learning. The confrontation had unraveled the mystery, yet it had left Sarah ensnared in an unsettling epiphany, the realization that the sanctuary of knowledge she had cherished was not immune to the insidious threats that festered within its corridors. The campus, once a beacon of scholarly pursuits, now harbored an enigma, a lurking menace that cast a pall over the very essence of Sarah's academic journey. In the hushed silence of the night, Sarah stood at the threshold of a disquieting revelation. A revelation that within the halls of higher education lay secrets far more sinister than any lesson the textbooks could impart. Story 4. Amelia Carter had always been attuned to the subtle shifts in her surroundings. It started with a fleeting glance from a stranger on her morning commute, a whisper of familiarity in the bustling cityscape. Insignificant, she had thought at first, until a series of incidents began to unravel the fragile tapestry of her life. One crisp autumn morning, as Amelia emerged from her apartment building, she caught a glimpse of a figure lingering in the shadows, a silhouette veiled by the early morning mist. The person vanished into the bustling crowd before she could discern more than a haunting impression, leaving her unsettled and on edge. Days passed, and Amelia's unease grew. She noticed a series of subtle but scary signs, a flickering street lamp that seemed to follow her on her evening walks, a cryptic note tucked beneath her door, and inexplicable phone calls that dissolved into static when answered. The messages were cryptic, fragments of sentences that hinted at a familiarity with her past, details only someone intimately acquainted with her life could possess. Paranoia gnawed at the edges of her mind, and she found herself scrutinizing every passerby, every shadow that danced along the pavement. As the incidents escalated, so did Amelia's desperation to unearth the elusive stalker. She combed through the corridors of her memory, searching for a connection to the cryptic messages, but the past offered no solace, only a labyrinth of uncertainties. The turning point came when she stumbled upon an old journal, its pages yellowed with time. Buried within its faded ink lay the remnants of a long-forgotten friendship, a friendship that had soured into betrayal and resentment. With a jolt of realization, Amelia made a connection. The stalker's cryptic messages held echoes of a past she had tried to bury, a past entangled in broken promises and shattered trust. Fueled by a mix of fear and determination, Amelia delved deeper, seeking answers to the haunting puzzle that had invaded her life. Each step she took seemed to bring her closer to the truth, a truth veiled in shadows and obscured by a relentless pursuer. One fateful evening, as the city lay shrouded in darkness, Amelia found herself at the rendezvous point, a desolate alleyway that bore witness to the climax of her unsettling pursuit. The stalker stood before her, their face obscured by the cloak of night. A silence hung in the air as Amelia confronted the mysterious figure, a culmination of weeks of torment and uncertainty. The stalker's whispered words carried a familiarity, the echo of a voice from the past that sent shivers down her spine. "You thought you could escape me," the stalker hissed, their voice laced with a haunting familiarity. "But the past always finds a way back." Amelia's heart raced, her breath shallow as she grappled with the horrifying revelation, a revelation that unraveled the sinister connection to her own history. Before she could respond, the stalker vanished into the obscurity of the night, leaving Amelia haunted by the realization that the past she had long tried to forget had returned with a vengeance. As the night drew to a close, Amelia stood alone in the alleyway, her mind reeling with the unsettling encounter. The stalker's warning lingered, a reminder that the echoes of the past could never truly be silenced. And though the confrontation had ended, the true horror lay in the realization that the haunting pursuit might never cease, leaving Amelia ensnared in an inescapable web spun from the tangled threads of her own history. Haunted by the unsettling encounter, Amelia found herself entangled in a maze of conflicting emotions, fear, confusion, and a haunting sense of déjà vu that clawed at her thoughts. The stalker's words reverberated in her mind, a ceaseless echo that refused to fade. Days became restless nights as Amelia grappled with the stalker's cryptic warning. She sought solace in the semblance of normalcy, but each mundane task was tainted by the ominous shadow of her past. In a desperate bid to break free from the relentless pursuit, Amelia sought refuge in the familiar confines of her childhood home. A quaint cottage nestled amid the tranquil countryside, a sanctuary she hoped would shield her from the haunting specter that had invaded her life. However, the solitude only amplified her paranoia. In the quietude of the countryside, Every rustle of the leaves, every creak of the floorboards, carried a sinister implication. The stalker's unsettling messages lingered, their cryptic resonance echoing within the walls of the cottage. One evening, as twilight painted the sky in hues of amber and indigo, Amelia ventured into the surrounding woods, seeking solace in the tranquility of nature. The whispers of the leaves seemed to offer a fleeting respite from the suffocating grip of fear that plagued her. Yet, as dusk descended, an ominous sensation pricked at the edges of her consciousness. A shadow flitted between the trees, a specter veiled in darkness, an unwelcome visitor in the sanctuary she had sought. Panic surged within her, the sensation of being watched intensifying with every step she took. In a frenzied attempt to escape the encroaching terror, Amelia raced through the entangled paths, the haunting whispers of her past entwined with the echoes of the present. A sudden realization struck, an epiphany born from the convergence of fear and determination. With a resolve fueled by desperation, Amelia turned to confront the elusive figure that had dogged her steps. "Who are you?" she called out, her voice quivering but resolute, seeking answers that had eluded her for too long. A fleeting figure emerged from the shadows, a silhouette familiar yet shrouded in mystery. As it drew closer, Amelia's breath hitched, a collision of dread and recognition coursing through her veins. The figure stepped into the dim light, revealing a face she had long tried to forget, a face from her past, an acquaintance who had once been a trusted confidant but whose intentions had curdled into darkness. "You thought you could escape your past," the figure uttered, their voice laced with a haunting familiarity. "But the truth always catches up." Amelia's heart pounded against her chest, the past and present colliding in an unsettling crescendo. Memories of betrayal and unresolved grievances surfaced, intertwining with the realization that the stalker was none other than a past acquaintance, a person she had once trusted implicitly. A whirlwind of emotions swirled within her, a blend of rage, fear, and an overwhelming sense of betrayal. Before she could respond, the figure dissolved into the obscurity of the surrounding woods, leaving Amelia enveloped in a vortex of unresolved emotions and haunting revelations. As the night enveloped the tranquil countryside, Amelia stood amidst the silence, a tumultuous storm raging within her. The encounter had answered some questions but left a trail of unanswered queries. An unresolved chapter from her past had resurfaced, leaving her ensnared in a haunting web spun from the tangled threads of betrayal and fear. With a heavy heart burdened by the echoes of her past, Amelia knew that the confrontation had only scratched the surface of a mystery far more intricate and unsettling than she could have imagined. The stalker's ominous warning reverberated within her, a grim reminder that the pursuit was far from over, and the tendrils of her past would continue to ensnare her in an inescapable cycle of fear and uncertainty.